around 4,500 years ago in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwest India. A civilization existed that most people have never heard of. And that's strange, because by almost any measure, it was one of the most advanced societies on the planet at the time. We're talking about cities with grid-patterned streets, drainage systems more sophisticated than what you'd find in some places 3,000 years later, standardized weights and measures used across a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. This was the Indus Valley Civilization, and at its peak it may have been home to over 5 million people. Now here's where things get strange. Ancient Egypt left us pyramids and pharaohs and detailed records of dynasties rising and falling. Rome left us the story of its own dramatic collapse, sieges, sackings, emperors murdered in the streets. Mesopotamia gave us clay tablets describing wars and conquests in vivid detail. But the Indus Valley Civilization, it just fades. No burned cities full of skeletons. No triumphant invader's account of conquest. No final desperate letter begging for help that never came. The cities were simply slowly abandoned, and nobody can agree on why. This is genuinely one of the strangest mysteries in archaeology. A civilization sophisticated enough to build cities with covered sewers and standardized bricks somehow left behind almost no explanation for its own ending. We have their pottery, we have their seals with animals and symbols carved into them. We have their city layouts mapped out in incredible detail. What we don't have is their voice, at least not one we can read yet, and we definitely don't have a clear final chapter. If you're listening to this while drifting off to sleep, that's exactly what these videos are designed for. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are. I love seeing this. Last time I checked, someone was listening in Mumbai at midnight, someone else in Toronto just waking up for work. It's strange and kind of wonderful. Thousands of people around the world drifting into this ancient mystery together at completely different hours. So, what actually happened to the Indus Valley Civilization? Over the years, researchers have proposed a whole lineup of suspects. Rivers that shifted their courses and abandoned the cities built along them. A monsoon system that grew unreliable, drying up the agricultural surplus that fed those massive urban populations. A trade network stretching all the way to Mesopotamia that slowly unraveled. Disease that spread through densely packed cities. Waves of migration that moved people toward new regions entirely. Or maybe something more subtle. A society so specialized, so dependent on specific systems working perfectly, that it simply couldn't adapt when the environment shifted beneath it. The honest answer is that archaeology can only take us so far here. We can see the cities being built up over centuries. We can trace pottery styles changing, populations shifting towards smaller settlements, certain crafts disappearing from the archaeological record. What we can't do, at least not with certainty, is read their minds, hear their explanations, or find a single smoking gun that explains everything. This is a mystery that resists easy answers, and honestly, that's what makes it worth exploring properly, instead of settling for the tidy textbook version most people learned in school, the one about an Aryan invasion that, as we'll get into, most historians now consider seriously outdated. Before we go further, if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's quiet mysteries, following the show on Spotify genuinely helps more than you'd think. And if you've got a moment, a 5-star review makes a real difference in keeping this going. The link's in the description below. Now let's go back to where this all began, in the river valleys, where one of humanity's greatest early civilizations quietly built something remarkable, and then, just as quietly, let it go. Let's talk about scale for a moment, because until you understand how big this civilization actually was, the mystery of its ending doesn't fully land. Picture a map. Not a small kingdom tucked into one river valley, but a cultural zone stretching across what is now most of Pakistan, reaching into northwest India, brushing the edges of Afghanistan, and extending down toward the coast of the Arabian Sea. We're talking about a territory covering over 1 million square kilometers at its height. To put that in perspective, that's larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The two civilizations we usually think of as the giants of the ancient world, and yet somehow the Indus Valley Civilization barely registers in most people's mental map of ancient history. That alone should tell you something strange is going on here. This wasn't a handful of scattered villages either. Archaeologists have identified over 1,000 settlement sites connected to this civilization, ranging from small farming hamlets to massive urban centres that would have been genuinely impressive by any standard, ancient or modern. And when we say urban centres, we're not exaggerating for effect. These were real cities, planned, organised, and in some cases home to tens of thousands of people. Let's start with the two names most people might have vaguely heard before, if they've heard anything at all: Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Harappa actually gave the whole civilization its alternate name, the Harappan civilization, because it was the first major site excavated back in the 1920s, located in what's now Punjab, Pakistan. Harappa was a sprawling urban centre with citadels, granaries and residential districts laid out with a level of planning that would make some modern city councils jealous. Then there's Mohenjo-daro, probably the most famous Indus site, and for good reason. This city, located along the Indus River in modern Sindh province, Pakistan, had an estimated population that some researchers put as high as 40,000 people. It had a sophisticated drainage system running beneath its streets, public buildings that some archaeologists believe served ceremonial or administrative purposes, and a level of urban organisation that seems almost eerily modern. We'll dig much deeper into Mohenjo-daro later, because its story is central to how people have imagined this civilization's downfall. But for now, just hold on to this. Two major cities, hundreds of kilometres apart, sharing remarkably similar layouts, building techniques and material culture. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. And the pattern keeps going. Head east into what's now the Indian state of Drought, and you'll find Dholavira, a walled city built on an island in the Rann of Kutch, featuring an elaborate water conservation system with massive reservoirs cut into rock. In a region prone to unpredictable rainfall, the people of Dholavira engineered their way around the problem centuries, before anyone else was thinking that systematically about water storage. Move further into Haryana in modern India, and you'll find Rakhigarhi, which some archaeologists now argue may have been even larger than Mohenjo-daro itself, though excavation there is still ongoing and far from complete. Then there's Ganari-Wala, a massive site in Pakistan's Cholistan desert that's barely been excavated at all, sitting there in the sand, potentially rivaling the biggest Indus cities in size, and we still don't fully know what secrets it's holding. And down on the coast, there's Lothal, a port city in Gujarat, with what appears to be a dockyard, evidence that these people weren't just building impressive cities inland, they were engaging in maritime trade, sending goods out into the Arabian Sea and likely all the way to Mesopotamia. So when we say the Indus Valley Civilization was one of the largest cultural zones of the Bronze Age world, we're not throwing around a vague superlative. We mean cities separated by hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 kilometres, all sharing standardised weights, similar brick sizes, comparable urban planning principles, and a writing system that shows up on seals from one end of this territory to the other. Imagine finding nearly identical city blueprints in cities as far apart as modern-day Los Angeles and Chicago, built during the same centuries, without any obvious central government forcing that uniformity. That's roughly the scale of consistency we're dealing with here. Now, before we go further, we need to talk about chronology, Because this civilization didn't just appear overnight fully formed, and it didn't end overnight either. The story stretches back further than most people realize. Long before the great cities existed, there were early regional farming communities in the Indus region, going back potentially as far as 7000 BCE in places like Mehrgarh, where people were domesticating plants and animals, developing pottery, and slowly building the cultural foundations that would eventually support massive urban centres. Over thousands of years, these early communities grew, developed regional styles, established trade connections, and gradually became more interconnected. Then, around 2600 BCE, something shifted. This is when we enter what archaeologists call the mature Harappan period, the phase most people picture when they think of the Indus Valley Civilization. This is when the grid-pattern streets appear, when the standardized weights and measures spread across the entire territory, when the great cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reach their peak population and sophistication. This mature phase lasted for roughly 700 years, which is a genuinely long run for any ancient civilization to maintain this level of cultural consistency. And then, starting around 1900 BCE, things begin changing. Cities that had thrived for centuries start showing signs of transformation, not sudden destruction, but gradual shifts in how people were living, building, and organizing themselves. This later period, sometimes called the late Harappan phase, is where our mystery really begins to take shape, and we'll spend a lot of time there later in this video. But here's why the scale of all this matters so much to the mystery itself. When a small kingdom or a single city collapses, we're not usually shocked. Small polities rise and fall constantly throughout history, vulnerable to bad harvests, hostile neighbours, internal power struggles. But we're not talking about a small kingdom here. We're talking about a civilization that maintained cultural coherence across more than 1 million square kilometres for the better part of 1,000 years. When something operating at that scale begins to unravel, the explanation has to account for that scale. It has to explain why cities separated by vast distances with different local environments, different immediate resources, and presumably different local challenges all seem to experience some version of decline around a similar broad window of time. And this brings us to something crucial we need to get straight before going any further, because it's easy to slip into a misunderstanding here. Just because these cities shared standardized weights, similar city layouts, and comparable pottery styles doesn't necessarily mean they were united under one central government, one king, one capital, calling the shots. We tend to assume cultural uniformity means political unity, because that's the pattern we're familiar with from places like Egypt or Rome. But the Indus Valley Civilization might have worked completely differently. It's entirely possible these were independent or loosely connected city-states, sharing a common cultural template, trading with each other, perhaps sharing religious or administrative traditions, without ever being ruled by a single emperor or unified state apparatus. We genuinely don't know for certain, and that uncertainty matters enormously when we start asking why this civilization eventually declined. Because if it wasn't one empire, then its ending probably wasn't one event either. So what kind of society builds cities like this without leaving behind an obvious king? That question sits at the centre of the Indus mystery, because the cities themselves are speaking to us constantly. Not through readable texts, unfortunately. Their script still refuses to tell us what it says, but through streets, bricks, drains, wells, walls, workshops and neighbourhoods, these people left behind a physical record of how they organised daily life. And what that record seems to show is not a civilization built around glorifying one ruler. It looks more like a civilization built around making the whole system work. Walk through the excavated remains of Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, and one thing becomes immediately clear. These cities were not random piles of houses that slowly expanded into urban chaos. They were planned. Major streets ran in relatively straight lines. Smaller lanes branched off into residential blocks. Buildings were often arranged around courtyards. Neighbourhoods had their own wells, their own drains, their own access to water and waste disposal. This might not sound dramatic until you compare it with most ancient cities. Urban life is messy. It grows organically. One family builds beside another, a market expands, a temple gets bigger, a wall gets moved, and eventually you end up with a maze. The Indus cities had some of that too, especially after centuries of rebuilding. But underneath it, archaeologists can see a consistent logic. Streets were laid out with directions in mind. Houses had standardized building methods. Drainage systems connected private homes to public channels. There was planning before construction. There was coordination between people who may never have known each other personally. And then there are the bricks. Indus bricks appear again and again in a standard proportion, usually 1:2:4. A brick from Harappa could match the basic dimensions of a brick from Mohenjo-daro, hundreds of kilometers away. The exact materials varied by region. Some places used baked brick more heavily, others relied on mud brick or stone, but the proportions kept showing up. Now, a standard brick ratio might sound like the least exciting clue in the history of archaeology. But think about what it means. It means builders in distant cities were working from shared expectations. Walls, drains, platforms and wells could be constructed using familiar measurements. Construction was not improvised every time. There was a system. Maybe officials enforced it. Maybe guilds of builders carried it from city to city. Maybe it was simply a deeply rooted cultural practice taught across generations. We don't know, but a society does not maintain standards across a territory this large by accident. The drainage networks are even more remarkable. At Mohenjo-daro, many houses had bathrooms or washing areas with sloped floors. Water could run into covered brick drains beneath the streets. Some drains had inspection holes or removable covers, meaning someone had to clean them. Wastewater management requires more than engineering. It requires routine. It requires people agreeing somehow that this channel must stay clear. This street must not become a sewer. This well must remain usable for everyone nearby. And wells were everywhere. Mohenjo-daro alone may have had hundreds, possibly more than 700. Some were private or attached to homes. Others were shared by neighbourhoods. At Dholavira, where water was especially precious, the city included massive reservoirs and channels designed to capture seasonal runoff. This was not just a population surviving beside rivers. This was a population actively managing water on an urban scale. That tells us something important. The Indus people were not only capable of organising labour for one spectacular project. They were capable of maintaining systems. There is a difference. Any ruler can force thousands of people to build a monument once. Keeping drains functional, wells maintained, streets usable, and brick standards consistent across generations requires an institution, or several institutions, embedded in everyday life. And yet, when archaeologists go looking for the people at the top of this system, the evidence gets strangely quiet. In Egypt, ancient power announces itself. You see it in pyramids, colossal statues, royal tombs overflowing with wealth, temple inscriptions celebrating kings who conquered enemies and commanded the gods. In Mesopotamia, rulers left names everywhere. They carved them into stone. They stamped them into bricks. They recorded wars, taxes, victories, temple construction, and the occasional reminder that they were favoured by heaven. The Indus world gives us almost none of that. There are large raised areas at cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, often called citadels. There are substantial public buildings, There is the famous Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, a carefully constructed sunken tank sealed with bitumen, probably used for ritual bathing or some kind of civic ceremony. There are large structures once interpreted as granaries, though exactly how they functioned is still debated. There are walls, platforms, gateways, and carefully controlled spaces. But there is no universally accepted palace, no giant royal tomb, no clear dynasty of named kings, no procession of monumental statues showing one ruler crushing prisoners beneath his feet. There is a small sculpture sometimes called the Priest King, a bearded figure wearing a patterned robe discovered at Mohenjo-daro. But that name is mostly archaeology's imagination, filling in a blank. He may have been a religious figure, an elite official, an ancestor, or something else entirely. One small statue is not a royal ideology, and that absence has led to a tempting conclusion. Maybe the Indus civilization was unusually equal. Maybe it had no kings, no ruling class, no hierarchy at all. It is a beautiful idea. It is also probably too simple. Absence of a visible king is not proof that authority did not exist. Some houses were clearly larger and better built than others. Certain neighborhoods appear more prosperous. Rare materials moved through elite hands. Seals, standardized weights, and controlled production suggest administrators, merchants, craft specialists, or officials who had influence over trade and exchange. The cities required labor to build and maintain. Somebody made decisions about walls, streets, water, storage, and construction. Somebody had the power to coordinate people, whether that power came from wealth, family status, religious authority, commercial networks, or control over knowledge. The question is not whether the Indus world had hierarchy. It almost certainly did in some form. The question is what kind. Maybe power was distributed among merchant families who controlled long-distance trade. Indus seals appear at sites in Mesopotamia, while Mesopotamian texts mention a place called Meluha, widely believed by many scholars to refer to the Indus region. If goods were moving across the Arabian Sea and through networks stretching thousands of kilometers, then people who managed those networks would have mattered enormously. Maybe authority rested partly with ritual specialists. The Great Bath, recurring animal imagery on seals, carefully structured urban spaces, and possible ceremonial buildings hint at shared beliefs, though we still cannot confidently reconstruct the religion behind them. Maybe kinship groups controlled neighborhoods, wells, workshops, and local labor. Maybe city governance was handled by councils rather than kings. Maybe different cities had different arrangements while following the same cultural rules. A merchant elite in one place, a ritual institution in another, a coalition of powerful households somewhere else. That would help explain something we saw in the previous section. Cultural unity does not necessarily require one empire. The Indus system may have been more like a vast network running on common standards. Shared weights, shared seals, shared construction practices, shared ideas about cleanliness, water, trade, and urban order. It could have been coordinated without being centralized in the way Egypt was centralized. Think of it less like one giant machine with a single person pulling a lever, and more like a network of linked systems. Each city had its own people, local resources, and local leadership. But all of them depended on rules that made cooperation possible across enormous distances. And that matters because networks can be incredibly resilient. If one city suffers a flood, trade can reroute. If one harvest fails, goods can come from elsewhere. If one local authority collapses, neighboring communities may keep functioning. But networks can also weaken quietly, not with one dramatic explosion, but through a gradual loss of trust, coordination, and shared incentives. If the Indus civilization had been ruled by one king, we might expect a more familiar story. A dynasty falls, an army invades, a capital is sacked, a new ruler takes over. But if its power was spread across merchants, neighbourhoods, religious institutions, local elites, and interdependent cities, then decline could look very different. It could begin when drains stop getting repaired, when standardised bricks stop being made, when trade becomes less reliable, when a city can no longer coordinate the labour needed to manage its water, when people decide that maintaining urban life is no longer worth the cost, and that is the unsettling possibility hanging over the ruins. The Indus cities may not have needed a conquering king to destroy them. They may have depended on something much harder to see and much easier to lose, a shared system of order. And if there was one thing that could tell us how that shared system worked, it would be the writing. The Indus people did write. They left behind hundreds of symbols, arranged in short sequences on seals, tablets, pottery, tools, copper objects, and small fragments of ivory or shell. Archaeologists have found thousands of these inscriptions across the Indus world, from the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro to smaller settlements, trading centres, and ports along the coast. So this is not a civilization without writing. It is a civilization with writing that we cannot read. And that difference is enormous. Most people imagine ancient writing as long walls of text, kings announcing victories, priests recording offerings, officials counting grain, scribes describing floods, wars, taxes, marriages, land disputes, and the bad decisions of people who were probably very confident at the time. That is not what we have from the Indus civilization. What we have are tiny messages. A typical Indus inscription contains only a handful of signs, 5 symbols, 7, maybe 10. Some are longer, but very few are long enough to resemble a sentence, let alone a historical account. The longest known examples are still frustratingly brief. They give us sequences, not stories, labels perhaps, names, titles, ownership marks, religious formulas, trade identifications, administrative codes. But perhaps is doing a lot of work there, because nobody has deciphered them. The signs themselves are striking. There are symbols that look like fish, jars, leaves, combs, forks, tridents, gates, circles, and abstract geometric forms. Some appear again and again. Some are rare. They are often arranged in a consistent direction, probably right to left in many cases, though not every example is completely clear. On seals, the writing is often placed above an animal image, a powerful-looking bull with a single horn, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a water buffalo, a tiger, or strange composite creatures that may have carried symbolic meanings we can no longer recover. The most famous of these animals is the so-called unicorn. It appears constantly on Indus seals, not a horse with a magical horn in the modern sense. More like a highly stylized bull or bovine creature, shown in profile, with one long horn projecting forward. In front of it is usually an object that has been called a manger, a ritual stand, a filter, or something else entirely. Nobody agrees on what that object is. Nobody knows why the unicorn appears so often. And nobody knows whether the signs above it identify an individual, a family, an institution, a deity, a cargo, a profession, or a category of goods. That is the problem in miniature. The Indus people are surrounded by symbols. They are clearly communicating something. They may even be communicating a great deal. But the code between us and them has not been broken. Now, deciphering an ancient script is never easy, but there are a few things that can make it possible. One is a bilingual inscription. That is the jackpot. A text written in an unknown language beside the same text in a known language. The Rosetta Stone gave scholars ancient Egyptian and Greek that allowed them to compare names, titles, repeated phrases, and eventually unlock hieroglyphs. The Indus civilization has no Rosetta Stone. Another useful thing is long texts. Long texts let you spot patterns. You can identify repeated words. You can test whether a sign sequence behaves like a name, a verb, a title, a number, or a grammatical ending. You can compare one document to another and slowly build a map of how the language works. The Indus script gives us almost nothing long enough to do that confidently. Imagine trying to decipher English if every surviving text said only property of, 10 jars, temple storehouse, merchant so-and-so, or deliver to the west gate. You might recognize that some symbols repeat. You might guess that some are names, but you would not be able to reconstruct the language, the politics, the laws, or the history of the people who used it. And that is before we even get to the question nobody can answer for sure. What language were they speaking? The Indus world sat in a region that would later become home to many language families. Some scholars have argued that the script may record an early Dravidian language. Others have proposed links to Munda languages, Indo-Aryan languages, or language families that no longer exist. Some researchers have even questioned whether the symbols represent full writing at all, suggesting they may have been a system of emblems or non-linguistic signs. That last idea remains controversial. The repeated structure of the inscriptions, the order of signs, and their wide use across different objects lead many specialists to think the system probably did encode language in some way, but probably is not decipherment. We still do not know what a single Indus sign sounded like. We do not know how its grammar worked. We cannot read a seal and say, with confidence, this belonged to a trader named Devaka, or this shipment contains cotton, or this is an offering to a river god, which means the civilization has denied us the kind of evidence historians usually dream about. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets can tell us when harvests failed. They record grain rations, debts, land sales, royal building projects, trade agreements, legal disputes, and desperate pleas for help. We have letters from officials complaining about shortages. We have kings boasting about wars. We have temple accounts showing what moved in and out of storage. Sometimes we even have evidence of ordinary people trying to survive, when the larger system around them was breaking down. Egyptian records can be just as revealing. Royal inscriptions celebrate victories, often with a healthy amount of exaggeration. Administrative documents track taxes and labour. Tomb inscriptions preserve titles and family connections. Texts can mention low floods, failed crops, political rivalries, raids, and royal responses to crisis. Of course, written records are never neutral. Kings lie. Officials hide failures. Victories get carved into stone. Defeats tend to vanish. But even propaganda tells you what rulers wanted people to believe. The Indus world gives us no readable royal propaganda at all. No king saying, "I restored the canals after the Great Flood." No official recording, "The harvest failed for 3 years." No city council ordering grain to be redistributed. No merchant writing, "Ships from Meluha did not arrive." No survivor describing a city emptied by disease. No conqueror claiming credit for burning Harappa. And that silence changes everything about the collapse. When historians investigate the fall of a literate state, they can sometimes compare physical evidence with written testimony. A drought layer in the soil can be placed beside a letter mentioning failed rains. Burned buildings can be compared with military records. A sudden drop in trade goods can be matched with documents about war, blockade, piracy, taxes, or political upheaval. For the Indus civilization, the physical evidence has to carry almost the entire argument by itself. A city street is repaired less often. What does that mean? A seal style becomes less common. What does that mean? A settlement is abandoned. Why, people begin using smaller villages rather than major cities. Was that a crisis? A migration? A new economic strategy? A shift in political power? A response to changing rivers? Or simply a different way of living that left fewer monuments behind? The artifacts do speak, just not in sentences. Seals, for example, may reveal a world of administration and exchange. Their standardized size and careful carving suggest they were not random decorations. Many were probably used to mark goods, identify people or institutions, or authorize transactions. Some bear traces of having been pressed into clay. That points toward a system where identity, ownership, or official recognition mattered. Standardized weights tell a similar story. Across a huge area, traders and officials seem to have used shared measures. That does not prove a single central government, but it does suggest trust, regulation, and repeated interaction between distant communities. You do not need to know the language to see that people were trying to make exchange predictable. The signs themselves may also preserve patterns of social organization. Certain inscriptions occur on certain kinds of objects. Some symbols are common in one region and rare in another. Some seal motifs may have been linked to particular groups, occupations, lineages, institutions, or ritual identities. If a sign sequence appears repeatedly beside a specific animal, that may not be accidental. It could represent a title, a clan, a merchant house, a cult, a city office, or something we have not even thought to ask. But every interpretation has a wall in front of it. We can count the signs, we can map where they appear. We can compare their order, we can use computers to test whether the sequences show regular structure. We can ask whether they resemble known writing systems. We can look for links with later languages, and scholars have done all of this for decades. Still, the script will not speak. That leaves us in a strange position. We know the Indus people had systems of communication sophisticated enough to be repeated across an enormous civilization. We know they marked objects with signs that mattered. We know their cities depended on standards, measurements, exchange, and coordination. But when the system began to change, the people who lived through it left us no readable explanation. Maybe they recorded one on perishable materials that vanished thousands of years ago. Palm leaves, cloth, wood, bark, leather, wax, painted boards. Maybe the long records existed, but the climate and time destroyed them. Or maybe the surviving seals were never meant to preserve history in the first place. Maybe they were the equivalent of signatures, labels, badges, and stamps, useful to the people who used them, nearly useless to us without the larger archive around them. Either way, this is why the Indus collapse remains so difficult to explain. We are not reading the final reports of a kingdom in trouble. We are studying bricks that stopped following old proportions, drains that were no longer maintained, trade goods that became less common, settlements that changed shape, rivers that shifted, bones, seeds, sediments, flood deposits, abandoned workshops and silent seals. The written record is there, it is just locked, and until someone finds the key, every theory about the end of the Indus civilization has to begin with an uncomfortable admission. We do not know what the people themselves thought was happening. So before we ask why the Indus civilization collapsed, we need to ask a more basic question. What do we mean by collapse? Because that word creates an image immediately. A city burning in a single night, armies pouring through gates, palaces destroyed, bodies in the streets, a king killed, a dynasty ended, and an entire civilization falling off a cliff. That is how collapse looks in movies. Sometimes it even looks that way in archaeology. But the Indus case is different. There is no single layer across the entire civilization showing cities destroyed at the same moment. No known written account announcing a final catastrophe. No obvious last battle. No universally accepted date when Harappan society simply stopped existing. What archaeologists see instead is a long transformation, unfolding unevenly across a vast region. Around 1900 BCE, give or take a century depending on the place, and the evidence being used, the phase known as mature Harappan urbanism began to change. The great cities did not all vanish on one terrible afternoon. Some had already been changing for generations. Others continued to be occupied, but in smaller, altered forms. New communities appeared in different regions. Older connections weakened. Familiar standards became less consistent. So when people say the Indus civilization collapsed, they usually do not mean that every Indus person disappeared. They mean that a particular system stopped working in the way it once had. The system of large planned cities, the system of long-distance exchange linking river valleys, farming villages, craft centres, ports, and foreign trade partners. The system of standardized bricks, weights, seals, and perhaps shared institutions that made life across an enormous territory look surprisingly coordinated. The system that gave us Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, Ganariwala, Lothal, and dozens of other settlements connected by patterns we can still recognize 4,000 years later. That system changed, but a system is not the same thing as its people. Imagine a modern country where the largest cities shrink, national trade breaks down, factories close, money becomes unreliable, and roads are no longer repaired. From far away, future archaeologists might call that a collapse, and they would not be completely wrong, but the people would still be there. Families would still cook meals, farmers would still plant crops, potters would still make vessels, children would still learn stories, skills, names, rituals and rules from their parents. Communities might move, they might become poorer, they might become more local. They might stop using the same tools, the same measurements, or the same public buildings. But they would not become ghosts. That distinction matters because the phrase "the Indus people vanished" is misleading. The archaeological record does not show an empty subcontinent after 1900 BCE. It shows people living differently. This later period is usually called the Late Harappan phase, and even that name can be deceptive because it makes the period sound like a weak final chapter after the real story has ended. But for the people living through it, it was not late anything. It was their present. They were not standing on a rooftop at Mohenjo-daro saying, "Well, this is unfortunate." Our civilization appears to be entering its terminal phase. They were making decisions with the information they had. Perhaps a family left a flood-prone neighborhood and moved to a smaller town. Perhaps a craft worker found that merchants no longer arrived with raw materials from far away and began producing goods for local customers instead. Perhaps a farming community moved closer to a more dependable water source. Perhaps regional leaders gained influence as the old urban networks became harder to maintain. To us, those changes become categories in a textbook. Mature Harappan, late Harappan, decline, transformation. Collapse but archaeological periods are labels created thousands of years after the fact. They are useful. Without them, the evidence would be chaos. Yet they can also make a slow process look sharp and clean, as if one age ended on Friday and another began on Monday. Real social change rarely works that way. A seal style becomes less common. Standardized weights appear less often. Brick sizes stop following the familiar ratios seen in the great urban centres. Large public works are repaired less consistently. Workshops that once produced specialized goods at scale become smaller, more scattered, or disappear from particular cities. None of these things by themselves prove disaster. They are clues. A change in settlement size might mean population decline, but it might also mean people were dispersing into smaller communities. A decline in craft specialization might mean economic hardship, or it might mean production was shifting from centralized workshops to household labor. Reduced long-distance trade might mean foreign markets failed, routes became dangerous, rivers became harder to navigate, or local communities simply relied less on imported goods. The evidence tells us the old pattern was unraveling. It does not always tell us how that unraveling felt. And this is where the Indus story becomes more interesting than a simple tale of rise and fall. For centuries, the mature Harappan world had concentrated people, skills, labour, and resources into major urban centres. It maintained a remarkable degree of standardization across a territory larger than many ancient states. A merchant in one region could likely recognize weights, seals, brick conventions, and craft traditions used hundreds of miles away. Then, after around 1900 BCE, the shared system became less visible. Cities shrank or lost their old importance. Settlement patterns shifted. Regional styles became more distinct. The seal script, so common in the earlier period, became rare and eventually disappeared from use. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia declined. The old uniformity gave way to a patchwork that can look like collapse, but it can also look like decentralization. Instead of one broad urban civilization organized through shared standards and far-reaching networks, the population may have become more regional, more rural, and more flexible. People may have moved toward areas where farming was more reliable. Local traditions may have mattered more than civilization-wide ones. The giant machine did not necessarily explode. It may have come apart piece by piece. And if that is what happened, then the question changes. We are no longer asking, what destroyed the Indus civilization? We are asking, what made its cities, networks, and institutions harder to sustain? Because somewhere in the archaeological record, that quiet unraveling begins to show itself. And this is where the clues become more concrete. Not a smoking gun. Not a final message carved into stone, a pattern at the great cities. The mature Harappan world had been built on repetition. The same brick proportions, the same carefully calibrated stone weights, the same seal forms, the same kinds of streets, drains, wells, workshops and storage spaces appearing across enormous distances. That repetition was not accidental. It meant people in different places were participating in a shared system. A trader could carry goods from one region to another and expect familiar measures. A craft worker could produce items that made sense within a market far beyond the neighbourhood. Builders knew the basic rules. Administrators, merchants, and customers apparently trusted the same standards. Then those standards begin to loosen. After roughly 1900 BCE, seals become much less common. The famous square seals with animal motifs and short inscriptions had been one of the most recognizable features of mature Harappan life. They were not just decorations. Many were probably connected to trade, ownership, administration, identity, or ritual. We cannot read the script, so we cannot say exactly how they worked. But we can see that they had once been everywhere in the urban system. Later, they largely disappear. The standardized stone weights that had allowed goods to be measured with remarkable consistency also become less widespread. In some areas, the old weight system persists for a time. In others, it becomes rare. The same thing happens with crafted goods that once travelled through long-distance networks. Beads, shell ornaments, specialized ceramics, metal objects, and other products do not vanish everywhere at once. But the large connected system that had moved raw materials and finished objects across the Indus world appears to weaken. Think about what that means in practical terms. A bead maker in a city like Mohenjo-daro may have depended on stone from distant regions, shell from the coast, fuel for kilns, skilled labour, merchants, transport routes, customers with purchasing power, and some authority capable of keeping the wider system predictable. If even a few of those links fail, specialised production becomes harder. If the problem continues for generations, the workshop does not need to burn down. It can simply stop operating at the old scale. The same is true of cities. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and other large centres show evidence of continued occupation after the height of the mature Harappan period. But their later levels often look different. Buildings are altered. Older structures are subdivided. Streets and drains are not always maintained with the same consistency. Construction becomes less uniform. In some places, people appear to have reused old materials rather than building according to the grand, standardized plans of earlier centuries. That does not mean the cities instantly became ruins. It means the old civic machine was no longer running in the same way. A major planned city is not just a collection of houses. It is an agreement maintained every day. Drains have to be cleared. Wells have to be repaired. Streets have to remain passable. Flood damage has to be managed. Building rules have to be enforced. Labour has to be organised. Resources have to arrive from outside the city walls. When those things happen generation after generation, the city feels permanent. When they happen less reliably, the change can be almost invisible at first. One blocked drain, one public building no longer repaired. One neighbourhood where houses expand into former lanes. One workshop abandoned. One section of wall rebuilt with whatever bricks are available. None of that looks like an apocalypse. But add it together across decades, and you get an urban landscape that is becoming harder to govern, harder to maintain, and perhaps less useful to the people living in it. The bricks tell part of this story too. Mature Harappan builders famously used bricks in highly regular proportions, often following a ratio that appears again and again across different settlements. That kind of consistency suggests shared technical traditions and perhaps shared rules. In later periods, those ratios become less dominant. Bricks can become more varied in size and form. In some places, older bricks are scavenged from earlier structures. Again, that is not proof that people forgot how to make bricks. It may mean that the institutions which once made uniform construction valuable were losing their reach. If you are building a small local house, you may not need bricks that match a civilization-wide standard. You need bricks that work. You need them now. You use local clay, local labour, local knowledge, and whatever material is available. That is a different kind of society, not necessarily a dead one. Pottery offers another clue, and also another warning. As the mature Harappan period gave way to later regional traditions, ceramic styles changed. In some areas, new painted designs appear. Vessel shapes shift. Production methods become more local. Archaeologists use these changes to identify different cultural phases and trace connections between settlements. But pottery can be deceptive if we ask it the wrong question. A new pottery style does not automatically mean a new population arrived and replaced everyone who was there before. People adopt new fashions all the time. They copy neighbours. They marry into other communities. They move a few miles and begin using clay from a different source. They change cooking methods. They alter what they grow, what they store, what they serve, and what they trade. Material culture changes because people change. But people changing is not the same thing as people disappearing. This is one of the biggest traps in the Indus story. Archaeologists find fewer seals, less standardized craft production, altered brick traditions, changing pottery, and reduced urban maintenance. It is tempting to imagine that the civilization was simply fading away. But the evidence is not that simple, because not every site follows the same path. Some large urban centres declined sharply. Some were abandoned or reduced in scale. Some settlements continued, but with altered layouts and different material traditions. Meanwhile, in other regions, especially farther east, communities remained active or new settlements became more important. The archaeological map does not show one giant civilization-wide shutdown. It shows uneven change. A city beside one river might face repeated flooding. A farming zone elsewhere might struggle with weaker monsoons. A town tied closely to long-distance trade might suffer when exchange routes faltered. Another community, less dependent on imported materials and urban markets, might adapt more easily. This is why the idea of a single collapse date is so misleading. Imagine standing in one settlement around 1900 BCE. The market is quieter than it used to be. Merchants arrive less often. A public drain has not been repaired. The old seal system is no longer used the way it once was. Families are moving out towards smaller villages. Now imagine standing hundreds of miles away. People are still farming, still making pottery, still raising animals, still building homes, but their connections, customs, and priorities are changing. Both places belong to the same broad transformation. Yet neither is experiencing it in exactly the same way. That is what an unraveling looks like in archaeology. Not one clean break, but a growing mismatch between the system that once existed and the conditions people now faced. The standardized world of the mature Harappans had depended on coordination at a huge scale. Once that coordination weakened, the signs appeared everywhere, in a weight that no longer matches the old sequence, in a seal no longer carved, in a drain left unrepaired, in a workshop producing for local customers instead of distant markets, in a city that becomes smaller, less ordered, more improvised. These are signs of urban decline. They are not signs of total societal extinction. The people of the Indus world did not leave behind a continent of empty streets and silent fields. They left behind evidence of adaptation, movement, local survival, and cultural change. The great urban order was breaking apart, but beneath that breaking apart, human communities were still making choices. And one of the most dramatic places to watch that process unfold is Mohenjo-daro, a city long treated as the scene of a sudden catastrophe. Its archaeology tells a much stranger story. For decades, Mohenjo-daro seemed to offer exactly what the Indus story was missing: a crime scene. Here was one of the largest cities of the ancient world, its streets buried beneath mud and brick. Here were damaged buildings, blocked drains, altered neighbourhoods, and, most dramatically, human bones found lying in streets and houses. To early archaeologists, the picture looked obvious. The city had been attacked. Its people had been slaughtered. The ruins were the final frozen moment of a civilization destroyed by invaders. It was a powerful story. It was also much more certain than the evidence allowed. The idea became especially influential in the mid-20th century, when the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler connected Mohenjo-daro to an older theory, the so-called Aryan invasion. According to this interpretation, incoming Indo-Aryan-speaking warriors had swept into the subcontinent from the northwest, destroyed the cities of the Indus civilization, and replaced their people and culture. Wheeler pointed to a small number of skeletons found at Mohenjo-daro. Some appeared to have been left where they fell. A few were found in or near streets. Others were associated with late structures, to a generation shaped by the archaeology of ancient battles that seemed like evidence of a massacre. He even linked the story to lines in the Rig Veda, ancient Sanskrit hymns composed centuries later, which described the god Indra as a destroyer of forts. The image was irresistible: invaders outside the walls. A city under siege, streets filled with the dead, the great Indus world ending in violence. But archaeology is rarely that neat. First, the human remains at Mohenjo-daro were not discovered together in one sealed destruction layer. They came from different parts of the site, and in some cases from different archaeological levels. They were not a single group of citizens killed on one terrible day. There are relatively few of them, especially for a city that may once have housed tens of thousands of people. That alone should make us cautious. If Mohenjo-daro had been captured in a city-wide massacre, where are the hundreds or thousands of victims? Where are the clear burn layers across the settlement? Where are the concentrations of weapons, broken defences, arrowheads and bodies buried beneath collapsed buildings from the same moment? Those things are not what the site provides. Some skeletons do show injuries or signs of hardship. But an injury is not automatically evidence of warfare. People fall, they are assaulted, they suffer accidents. They survive violence years before death. Bones can also be disturbed long after burial by erosion, digging, animals, later construction, and the complicated history of an ancient site being repeatedly occupied and rebuilt. A body found in a street does not necessarily mean someone died in that street while fleeing an army. It may mean the street was no longer functioning as a street when the body was deposited. It may mean later erosion moved material. It may mean earlier excavators, working with methods far less precise than those used today, could not establish every relationship between bone, soil, wall and layer with the certainty we would demand now. That does not mean nothing violent ever happened at Mohenjo-daro. Large cities have conflict. People can be killed without leaving behind evidence of an invasion. The point is narrower, but important. The famous skeletons do not prove the sudden violent destruction of the city. And once that conclusion weakens, the whole invasion story begins to lose its archaeological foundation. The old theory also rested on assumptions that were common at the time. Archaeologists often treated changes in pottery, burial customs, language, or settlement patterns as evidence that one people had arrived and replaced another. Civilizations were imagined as blocks on a map. When the material culture changed, the people must have changed too. But human societies do not work that simply. Languages can spread without mass conquest. New customs can be adopted through trade, marriage, migration, and prestige. Small groups can move into regions already occupied by others. Local populations can transform their own traditions over generations until the archaeological record looks very different. And in the case of the Indus civilization, the chronology is a major problem for the invasion as destruction model. The decline of the large Harappan cities was already underway around 1900 BCE. The oldest compositions of the Rig Veda are generally dated later than that, though the exact dates remain debated. Whatever the history of Indo-Aryan languages in South Asia may have been, there is no simple archaeological picture of Vedic warriors arriving at Mohenjo-daro and ending the civilization in one blow. Mohenjo-daro itself tells a slower, messier story. The city was built beside the Indus River, and that brought both wealth and danger. The river supported farming, transport, fishing, trade, and the dense population of an urban centre. But rivers like the Indus are not stable lines on a map. They flood, they shift channels, they deposit huge quantities of silt. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists found repeated layers of flood-laid sediment in parts of the site. Again and again, people seem to have responded by rebuilding floors, raising platforms, repairing walls, and constructing on top of what had come before. Imagine living in a city where the river does not destroy everything at once, but keeps returning. One flood leaves mud in lower areas, another damages homes. A drainage channel fills. A street needs to be raised. Wells must be cleared. Bricks have to be replaced. Families move into upper stories or more protected neighborhoods. Public works demand more labor, more planning, more material, more cooperation. For a while, a wealthy and organized city can absorb that pressure. But what happens when the wider system is already weakening? What happens when imported materials are harder to obtain, trade is less reliable, civic authority has less reach, and neighborhoods begin solving problems on their own? The late levels of Mohenjo-daro often look less like a city struck dead than a city under strain. Older buildings were modified and subdivided. Spaces that may once have had planned uses were adapted for new purposes. Some streets and drains were not maintained in the same way as before. Construction could become more irregular. People reused old bricks, built against earlier walls, and made practical changes that did not fit the original urban plan. That is not necessarily chaos, it is adaptation. But adaptation can also reveal that the old system is no longer functioning. A carefully planned city depends on maintenance. Mohenjo-daro had an extraordinary network of wells, drains, bathing areas, and brick-lined channels. That infrastructure was one of its great achievements. It also created a constant burden. Drains do not clear themselves. Wells need protection from contamination. Floodwater has to be diverted. Waste has to go somewhere. Buildings in a hot, crowded river plain require endless repair. As long as institutions can coordinate labour, those challenges are manageable. When that coordination frays, sanitation and maintenance become local problems. A household protects its own doorway, a neighbourhood patches its own drain. Someone builds over a passage because their family needs space. Each decision makes sense on its own. But together, over decades, they can make the whole city less functional. This is why damaged walls and scattered bones are so dangerous as evidence. They are vivid, they invite a final scene, but archaeology has to ask questions that stories prefer to skip. When was this wall damaged by flood, erosion, collapse, or people removing bricks? Did this body die before, during, or after the building changed? Do these artifacts belong to one moment, or were they mixed by centuries of rebuilding? Is this destruction a catastrophe, or simply the accumulated wear of a city that had been occupied for generations? Mohenjo-daro does not give us a clean answer, because its ending was probably not clean. It may have faced repeated floods, declining maintenance, shifting economic connections, and gradual population loss. Different districts may have changed at different times. Some residents may have left. Others may have stayed, reworking the old city into something smaller and less connected to the civilization that built it. The ruins can still look dramatic, but drama is not explanation. Mohenjo-daro became famous because it seemed to promise the perfect ending. A great city, a violent invasion, bodies in the streets, and silence afterward. Yet the closer we look, the more that certainty dissolves. The city was not necessarily the victim of one final disaster. It may instead be the clearest warning in the entire Indus story. When evidence is fragmented, the most compelling narrative is often the one we should trust least. And if Mohenjo-daro was not destroyed by an army, the next suspect is standing right beside it. The Indus River. For thousands of years, the river made urban life possible. It carried water across a dry landscape. It replenished fields with fertile sediment. It supported fishing, transport, and communication. It gave farmers a harvest without depending entirely on rainfall. In a world before pumps, railways, and concrete dams, a great river was not just useful. It was the foundation of everything. But the same river that made Mohenjo-daro rich could also turn against the city. The Indus is a massive, sediment-heavy river system fed by mountain snowmelt, glaciers, and monsoon rains. It does not flow politely between fixed banks forever. It rises, It spills across floodplains, it cuts into one channel and abandons another. It deposits mud where people built streets, walls, wells and homes. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists have long identified layers of silt and clay that appear to have been laid down by flooding in parts of the settlement. Similar concerns apply to other settlements built near major rivers and their branches. The evidence does not point to one single flood that swallowed the entire city in an afternoon. It points instead to something more exhausting, flooding that happened again. And again, imagine the problem from the perspective of a family living in the lower parts of the city. A flood comes through. Maybe it does not kill everyone. Maybe the water rises slowly enough for people to move belongings, livestock, food stores and children to safer ground. But when it recedes, it leaves behind mud. Thick mud. Mud in courtyards. Mud against doorways. Mud inside drains that had been designed to carry waste and wastewater away from homes. A brick wall saturated with water begins to weaken. A street becomes uneven. A well needs to be cleared and protected. A drain backs up. The next rainy season comes before every repair has been finished. So people rebuild. They raise a floor with packed earth and new brick. They build a new wall over the remains of an old one. They create a higher platform. They fill in a damaged passage and make another route around it. Over generations, whole neighborhoods can slowly rise above earlier levels, like a city climbing upward to stay ahead of the river. This kind of rebuilding is visible at Mohenjo-daro. But it is important to understand what it means. Raised construction is not automatically evidence that people gave up. In fact, it may show the opposite. It shows that people stayed. They organized labor. They gathered bricks. They cleared debris. They adjusted. A city that rebuilds after flood damage is a city still functioning, at least for the moment. Its residents have decided that the advantages of living beside the river are still worth the danger. And those advantages were enormous. Floodplains are among the most productive agricultural landscapes on Earth. When rivers overflow, they can deposit fresh layers of nutrient-rich silt across nearby land. That same mud that clogs a city street can help produce grain in the fields beyond it. Floodwater can recharge soils and wetlands. It can support grazing animals, fish, reeds, and all the smaller resources that help feed a dense population. This is the ancient bargain of river civilizations. You live with the flood because the flood helps sustain you. Egypt made that bargain with the Nile. Mesopotamian cities made it with the Tigris and Euphrates. The Indus cities made it with their own rivers. But every bargain has a cost. The more complex the city, the more expensive recovery becomes. A small village can move a few houses, abandon a damaged field, or shift to slightly higher ground. A city like Mohenjo-daro cannot do that easily. It has brick-lined wells, drainage systems, major streets, warehouses, workshops, houses built wall against wall, and thousands of people depending on those systems working together. After one flood, repair is a challenge. After repeated floods, repair becomes a permanent institution. Bricks must be made or reclaimed. Labour must be coordinated. Drainage routes must be restored. Public spaces must remain usable. Water supplies must be kept clean. And in a dense settlement, sanitation is not a private problem. If drains clog and wells become contaminated, one neighbourhood's failure can become another neighbourhood's disease risk. For centuries, the Indus cities seem to have handled these problems remarkably well. That is one reason their urban system is so impressive. They were not naive people caught by surprise the first time a river overflowed. They knew the landscape. Their cities had been built in a world of seasonal water, shifting channels, and flood risk. But there is a difference between surviving floods and thriving under them. Repeated flood damage could have slowly made urban life more costly. Not impossible, not instantly fatal, just harder to maintain year after year. And that distinction matters, because a city does not need to be physically destroyed to decline. It only needs to reach a point where rebuilding no longer seems worth the effort, where families can do better elsewhere, where merchants choose another route, where farmers move closer to more reliable water, where a smaller town with fewer drains and fewer massive brick structures to maintain becomes a more practical place to live. Still, there is a major problem with blaming the Indus River for the collapse of the Indus civilization. The civilization was enormous. Its settlements stretched across regions that are now part of Pakistan, northwest India, and beyond. Some were close to the Indus itself. Others stood near different river systems. Others were in areas shaped by seasonal streams, monsoon rainfall, coastal environments, or groundwater. Mohenjo-daro's flood problems were real, but Mohenjo-daro was not the whole civilization. A flood at one city does not explain why distant settlements changed their pottery, trade connections, population patterns, and urban organization. Even repeated flooding across one stretch of river cannot, by itself, explain why major cities declined across such a vast territory over centuries. This is the trap of dramatic evidence. At Mohenjo-daro, flood silt is tangible. You can see it in the ground. It feels like an answer. The river rose, the city suffered, and eventually the city weakened. That may be part of the story, but part is not the same as all. Local environmental stress can push a settlement toward decline without causing a civilization-wide transformation. One city may be burdened by floods, another may lose access to a river channel, another may face weaker harvests, another may survive by changing its economy, shrinking its population, or moving its center of life elsewhere. The Indus world was not a single machine with one point of failure. It was a network of cities, towns, farms, craft centers, and trade routes spread across an enormous and varied landscape. If that network unraveled, we should expect different communities to experience the pressure differently. At Mohenjo-daro, the river may have been a relentless force of wear, not a final blow, but a recurring bill that became harder to pay. And beyond the city, another change was beginning to reshape the entire region. The rains themselves were becoming less dependable. For much of the year, the Indus region is dry. The summer monsoon changes that. Moist air moves north from the Indian Ocean. Rain falls across different parts of the subcontinent. Rivers rise, seasonal streams begin to flow, grasslands recover. Farmers can plant crops that would fail in the dry months. Herd animals find fresh grazing land. Reservoirs, ponds, wells, and small channels are replenished. But the monsoon is not a switch that turns on at exactly the same strength every year. It is a system, and systems can become unstable. Evidence from lake sediments, cave formations, marine deposits, and other paleoclimate records suggests that monsoon patterns were changing during the later 3rd millennium and early 2nd millennium BCE, around the period when the great Indus cities were beginning to transform. In broad terms, many researchers see signs of weakening monsoon rainfall across parts of the region. But weaker monsoon can be misleading. It does not necessarily mean that every year was dry. It does not mean that rain simply disappeared and the entire civilization immediately starved. A weaker monsoon can mean shorter rainy seasons, rain arriving late after planting decisions have already been made, heavy rainfall compressed into a few destructive storms instead of spread across the season, long dry intervals interrupted by sudden floods, one area receiving enough rain while another, a few hundred miles away, receives almost none. For a farming society, reliability matters almost as much as total rainfall. Picture a farmer deciding when to sow seeds. Plant too early, and the rain may fail to arrive. The seeds die in dry soil, plant too late, and the growing season may be too short for the crop to mature. A family can survive one bad year by eating stored grain, selling animals, borrowing from relatives, or reducing what it consumes. But several uncertain seasons in a row begin to destroy the margins that make survival possible. Stored grain runs down, livestock are sold or slaughtered. Seed grain gets eaten, debt and dependency grow, and the next bad season becomes more dangerous than the last. The Indus civilization had more options than a single isolated farm. Its cities were connected to broad agricultural hinterlands. Grain, animals, raw materials, and manufactured goods moved between villages, towns, and urban centres. That network gave people resilience. If one place had a poor harvest, perhaps food could come from somewhere else. But networks only help when enough of the network is still producing a surplus. If rain becomes unpredictable across several important regions at once, the problem spreads outward. Farmers have less grain to send to cities. Pastoralists may move their herds in search of grazing, placing pressure on land already used by others. Water storage systems need to carry people through longer dry periods. Wells have to be dug deeper. Seasonal planning becomes guesswork, and cities are especially vulnerable to guesswork. A dense urban population cannot simply walk into the countryside and gather more food when supplies run low. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and the other great centres depended on a constant flow of necessities from beyond their walls. Grain, fuel, timber, animal products, labour, clay, salt, cotton, all the ordinary materials that make a city possible. When environmental conditions are stable, a specialised economy is incredibly powerful. One group grows food, another raises animals, another makes pottery, another produces beads, another works metal, merchants carry goods between them. Administrators, traders, craftspeople, builders and labourers can live close together because the system keeps moving resources where they are needed. But specialisation has a hidden weakness. The more people depend on one another, the more damaging disruption becomes. A farming family can change its crop mix. A herding community can move, at least within limits. A small village can reduce its needs, relocate a short distance, or reorganise around a different water source. But a major city has wells, drains, workshops, storage areas, public infrastructure, and thousands of mouths that require regular supply. Urban life works beautifully when the landscape is predictable enough to plan around. It becomes expensive when every season is a gamble. That does not mean climate change killed the Indus civilization. The evidence is not that simple. There is no single monsoon record that can be laid directly over a map of every Indus settlement, with every dry interval matched neatly to every abandoned neighbourhood. Paleoclimate records have their own dating ranges. Archaeological phases often stretch across generations or centuries. A cave deposit in one region may reflect rainfall patterns differently from a lake basin in another, and people were not passive instruments recording the weather. They adapted, moved, changed crops, altered trade routes, and rebuilt their communities. Matching climate shifts to human decisions is difficult, sometimes frustratingly difficult. We may know that rainfall patterns changed over a broad span of time, while still not knowing whether a particular settlement declined before, during, or after the most severe local effects. We may see a city shrink and be unable to say whether poor harvests pushed people away or whether declining trade made it harder to cope with poor harvests. Cause and effect begin to blur, but uncertainty does not mean the climate evidence is irrelevant. It means we have to use it carefully. Changing monsoon conditions are a plausible source of pressure, not a complete explanation, not a single catastrophic drought that emptied every city. A pressure, one that could make farming less secure, grazing more difficult, water management more demanding, and long-distance exchange less dependable. And its effects would not have been equal. This is crucial. A region that once depended heavily on monsoon-fed agriculture may have become more difficult to live in. But another region, perhaps closer to a reliable river, a groundwater source or a different rainfall pattern, may have become relatively more attractive. People did not necessarily vanish when conditions changed. They may have moved toward places that offered better odds. This is why the later Indus story is not simply one of abandonment. It is also a story of redistribution. Some large urban centres weakened. Some smaller settlements persisted. New areas became more important. Communities adjusted their crops, their connections, and perhaps even the scale of their political life. But rainfall was only one part of the water problem. Because even if the monsoon had remained perfectly reliable, it would not have saved a town whose river had stopped coming to it. And across parts of the Indus world, that may be exactly what happened. Rivers look permanent when you stand beside them. They are not. A river is a moving system. It shifts its channels. It abandons old courses. It cuts through one bank and deposits silt on another. It can split into several branches, then concentrate again into one deeper channel. Over centuries, a river that once supported farms, villages and towns can move far enough away to become almost useless to the people who depended on it. And in the northwestern part of the Indus world, one landscape has become central to this question: the Ghaggar-Hakra region. Today, the Ghaggar in India and the Hakra in Pakistan are largely seasonal or dry channels running through a landscape that once contained a remarkable number of archaeological sites. Many settlements associated with the broader Indus civilization cluster are along or near these old river courses. That pattern matters. People do not usually build hundreds of settlements beside a useless channel. These communities were responding to water, fertile floodplain soils, grazing land, transport routes, or some combination of all four. Even a river that did not flow year-round could be enormously valuable if monsoon runoff, groundwater, seasonal floods, and local channels made agriculture possible. But this raises the obvious question: what happened to the water? For generations, one answer has dominated popular imagination. The Ghaggar-Hakra, some have argued, was the ancient Saraswati, a mighty river described in later Vedic texts. In this version of the story, the river once flowed powerfully across the plains, sustained a major civilization, and then dried up. The loss of that river helped bring the Indus world down with it. It is a dramatic explanation. It is also much more complicated than it sounds. The word Saraswati belongs to ancient textual traditions. Ghaggar-Hakra refers to actual channels visible in the modern and archaeological landscape. Linking the two is not simply a matter of drawing a line on a map. It requires matching texts, sediments, ancient river paths, dates, climate records and settlement histories across thousands of years. And those lines do not always match cleanly. Some researchers argue that the Ghaggar-Hakra system once received water from major Himalayan rivers, perhaps from the Sutlej in the west, the Yamuna in the east, or both at different times. If true, this would have made parts of the system much larger than they are today. Other studies suggest a more limited picture. The channels may have been fed mainly by monsoon rainfall and smaller local rivers during the mature Harappan period, rather than by a massive perennial Himalayan river. There may have been older phases when large rivers flowed through parts of this landscape, but those phases could have occurred long before the height of Indus urban life. That difference is everything. A huge river that vanished before the cities flourished cannot, by itself, explain why those cities later changed. But a seasonal river system becoming less reliable during or after the urban period could still matter enormously. And rivers have many ways of becoming less reliable. Tectonic movement can slowly tilt a landscape, not necessarily with a single violent earthquake that tears the ground apart, but with gradual shifts over long periods. A slight change in elevation can alter the direction water prefers to flow. A river may begin favouring a neighbouring channel. Over time, more water goes one way, less goes another, and an established watercourse begins to weaken. Then there is river capture. This happens when one river system erodes into the drainage of another and effectively steals part of its flow. It sounds almost alive, like one river reaching over and pulling another river toward itself. But the result is physical. Water that once fed one basin is redirected into another. The Sutlej and Yamuna have both changed their courses repeatedly over geological time. Exactly when particular shifts occurred and how much water reached the Gagga-Hakra system at any given moment remains debated. But the larger principle is not controversial. The rivers of this region did not stay still. Sedimentation could create another problem. When rivers flood, they carry mud, sand, and silt. Flooding can enrich farmland, but it can also raise riverbeds, block smaller channels, and make water spread unpredictably across flat terrain. A channel may become choked with sediment. Water may break through a bank during a major flood and establish a new route. What had been a dependable source of water becomes a shallow, intermittent, or distant one. Now add changing rainfall. A strong monsoon can keep seasonal streams active and recharge groundwater even when no great Himalayan river is present. A weaker or less reliable monsoon can do the opposite. Channels that once flowed long enough to support farming may become shorter-lived. Floodplain ponds may fail to refill. Wells may need to reach deeper. Fields that benefited from regular moisture may become more difficult to cultivate. This is why the Lost River story cannot be reduced to one moment when a mighty Saraswati suddenly disappeared. The evidence points instead toward a changing hydrological landscape. Different channels changing at different times for different reasons. Tectonic shifts, sediment buildup, river migration, monsoon variability, local groundwater conditions, human decisions about where to farm and where to build, and settlement patterns suggest that people were responding to those changes. During the mature Harappan period, many communities existed across the Gagga-Hakra zone and surrounding plains. Later, the pattern shifts. Large urban centres decline. Settlement becomes more dispersed in many areas. Some populations appear to have moved eastward toward regions where monsoon-fed agriculture may have offered better prospects. Others remained in the northwest, but in smaller communities or altered economic systems. That does not mean every settlement beside a dry channel was abandoned because its river vanished. Some places may have declined for reasons of trade, politics, soil exhaustion, flooding, or changing social organisation. Some channels may still have supported seasonal farming for centuries. Archaeological dates are often broad enough that a precise sequence remains difficult to prove. But imagine living beside a river that no longer arrives when you need it. Your fields can survive a poor season, maybe two. You can dig deeper wells, build storage ponds, shift to hardier crops, move livestock farther in search of grazing, trade for grain if your connections remain strong. But eventually the calculation changes. Why keep rebuilding beside an unstable channel when another region offers more dependable rainfall, better groundwater, or a river that still flows? For a household, that may mean moving a few miles. For a village, it may mean relocating over generations. For a civilization built on networks linking farms, towns, workshops, and cities, it can mean the map itself is being rewritten. And when the water map changes, everything connected to it has to change too. But a changing water map does not mean the same thing everywhere. This is one of the biggest problems with the word drought. It makes us picture one giant dry spell rolling across the entire Indus world, striking every city, every farm, every village at exactly the same time. That is almost certainly the wrong picture. The Indus civilization covered an enormous area. It stretched from Sindh in present-day Pakistan, through Punjab and the plains of northwestern India, into Rajasthan and Gujarat, and up toward the Himalayan foothills. These were not identical environments. They did not receive water in the same way. They did not grow the same crops, keep the same animals, or face the same risks. A weaker monsoon could be devastating in one place and manageable in another. In Sindh, communities near the Indus relied heavily on a great river system. Seasonal flooding could leave behind moisture and fertile silt, allowing agriculture in a landscape where rainfall was limited. But this was never simple security. A river that fails to flood enough can hurt crops. A river that floods too violently can destroy homes, fields, and canals. For people living close to the Indus, the danger was not just drought. It was unpredictability. Punjab was different. This was a land of multiple rivers, tributaries, and broad plains. Some communities may have had access to more varied water sources than settlements farther south or east. But even there, a weakening monsoon, shifting river channels, or changes in seasonal flow could disrupt farming. A region can have several rivers and still suffer if the timing of water no longer matches the agricultural calendar. Then there was Rajasthan. Much of this region was always dry or semi-dry. Communities there could not simply assume that rainfall would arrive on schedule. They had to live with scarcity as a normal fact of life. That may sound like a disadvantage, but it could also create a kind of resilience. People already accustomed to uncertainty may have been better prepared to respond when conditions worsened. They could rely more heavily on pastoralism, moving cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals toward grazing land as seasons changed. They could use wells, small reservoirs, seasonal ponds, and carefully managed runoff. They could plant crops adapted to shorter growing seasons or lower rainfall. They could shift between farming and herding instead of depending completely on one fragile source of food. And nowhere is this clearer than Dholavira. Dholavira stood on Kadir Island in the Rann of Kutch, in what is now Gujarat. It was not built beside a massive, reliable river like Mohenjo-daro. Its environment was difficult. Rainfall was limited. Fresh water was precious. The surrounding landscape could be harsh, dry, and exposed. So the people of Dholavira did something extraordinary. They built a water management system on a scale that still amazes archaeologists. Channels directed seasonal runoff into large reservoirs. Stone-lined basins collected and stored water. Dams and embankments helped capture flows from nearby seasonal streams. Instead of waiting for a river to provide everything, the city appears to have treated every drop of water as something that had to be gathered, controlled, and preserved. That does not mean Dholavira was immune to climate stress. In fact, a city dependent on carefully stored water may have been extremely vulnerable if several poor monsoon seasons arrived in a row. Reservoirs can only store water that actually falls. But Dholavira shows something important. The Indus people were not passive victims standing around while climate changed. They understood difficult landscapes. They engineered solutions. They adapted architecture, storage, settlement placement, and probably daily routines to conditions that were never easy. And adaptation did not have to look the same in every region. A large city with thousands of residents, specialized craft workers, administrators, merchants, laborers, and dependent farming communities needed a huge and predictable flow of food, water, fuel, and raw materials. Its systems were efficient when conditions were stable, but efficiency can create vulnerability. If grain deliveries weaken, if wells run low, if transport routes fail, if surrounding villages produce less surplus, the city feels the pressure quickly. A smaller village may have had fewer reserves, but it also had fewer mouths to feed. It could relocate more easily. It could abandon a damaged field and cultivate another patch of land. It could keep livestock and move with them. It could switch crops. It could rely on family networks rather than distant institutions. It could survive by becoming less urban, less specialized, and more flexible. That is not necessarily prosperity. It may have meant harder lives, reduced trade, fewer luxury goods, and the loss of crafts that depended on large urban markets. But survival does not always look impressive in the archaeological record. A great city leaves walls, drains, warehouses, seals, and monumental reservoirs. A small farming settlement leaves far less behind. So, when the urban network began to weaken, some regions may have declined sharply, while others endured in altered forms. Sind may have faced one combination of river instability and reduced rainfall. The Gagahakra zone may have faced another. Drought had its own monsoon patterns, coastal resources, and water storage strategies. The Himalayan foothills, closer to smaller streams and different rainfall regimes, may have offered possibilities unavailable on the plains. The civilization did not need to fail everywhere for its urban system to fail. That is the distinction. A network can unravel even while many of its people survive. Cities can shrink while villages multiply. Long-distance trade can weaken while local exchange continues. A region can become less connected to the wider Indus world without becoming empty. So drought was not one event. It was a pressure applied unevenly across a vast and varied landscape. And uneven pressure has uneven consequences. For some communities, it may have meant crisis. For others, adaptation. But for the system that linked them all together, even small regional disruptions could become something much larger. And one of the most important systems connecting these regions was trade. Not local exchange, not a farmer trading grain for a pot in the next village. This was long-distance trade on a scale that tied the Indus world to places hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Indus merchants and craft goods reached Mesopotamia, in present-day Iraq. They moved through the Gulf, along the coast of Oman, and across the Iranian plateau. Communities in Gujarat had access to the Arabian Sea. Settlements farther inland were connected by routes carrying stone, metal, timber, shell, grain, cloth, and finished goods from one ecological zone to another. This was a civilization built across very different landscapes. And trade was part of what made that possible. Think about carnelian. Carnelian is a reddish-orange stone, beautiful when polished, difficult to work, and highly valued in the ancient world. Indus craftspeople became exceptionally skilled at shaping it into beads. Some of these beads have been found far from the Indus cities, including in Mesopotamia. Their drilling techniques, their forms, their quality, all point toward highly specialized production. And carnelian was only one piece of the network. The Indus region imported materials it did not possess in equal supply everywhere. Copper and other metals came through connections with Oman and the Iranian plateau. Lapis lazuli, probably moving through long chains of exchange from the mountains of Afghanistan, entered wider trade systems. Shell from coastal waters was worked into ornaments and carried inland. Timber, stone, and perhaps even food moved between regions with very different resources. Then there are the seals, small carved objects, often made of steatite, showing animals, symbols, and that still undeciphered Indus script. Indus-style seals have turned up in Mesopotamian contexts. Mesopotamian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, which many scholars identify with the Indus civilization, or at least with a region closely connected to it. The texts describe Meluhan goods. They mention Meluhan ships. One document even appears to refer to a Meluhan interpreter. That detail is extraordinary. An interpreter only matters when people speaking different languages are meeting often enough that communication has become a practical problem. It suggests trade was not just occasional contact between strangers. There were merchants, sailors, middlemen, dock workers, officials and translators operating across cultural boundaries. Some Indus people may have lived temporarily in Mesopotamian cities. Some Mesopotamian merchants may have travelled east. At the very least, both sides knew that a distant commercial world existed beyond the horizon. And this exchange did more than provide luxury items for wealthy people. It supported the structure of urban life. A city like Mohenjo-daro did not produce everything it needed within its own walls. Its beadmakers needed raw stone, its metal workers needed copper, its shell workers needed material from the coast, its merchants needed standardized measures. Its administrators, if that is what the seal users were, needed a reliable system for identifying goods, people, and transactions. That may help explain one of the most distinctive features of the Indus world, its astonishing standardization. Across enormous distances, archaeologists find carefully regulated stone weights. The same basic weight system appears again and again. Bricks often follow remarkably consistent proportions. Seals use recurring artistic conventions. Pottery styles, craft techniques, and settlement practices show a civilization that was not politically uniform in the modern sense, but was deeply coordinated. Trade does not require a centralized empire, but large-scale trade does reward trust. You need people to agree on what a weight means. You need merchants to know that a seal or mark will be recognized far away. You need routes that are safe enough, ports that function, and communities willing to provide food, labor, storage, and protection. In other words, commerce depends on stability, and stability was becoming harder to maintain. Around the same broad period that Indus cities began changing, the wider world of West Asia was changing too. Mesopotamia was not a permanent, unbroken marketplace. Its cities rose and fell, kingdoms expanded, fragmented, fought wars, and reorganized their economies. The Akkadian Empire collapsed centuries before the final decline of the major Indus cities, but the stresses that affected Mesopotamia did not simply vanish. Later states, including the the Third Kingdom, also fell apart around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Trade networks continued, but they changed. Political upheaval does not mean every ship stops sailing overnight. It means routes may become less secure, ports may lose support, demand from powerful palace economies may decline, merchants may seek different suppliers. A commodity that once travelled through several stable exchange points may suddenly become expensive, delayed, or impossible to obtain. And that matters if your cities have become dependent on specialized production. Imagine an Indus craft workshop built around carnelian beads. It needs raw material arriving from particular sources. It needs skilled labour. It needs customers with enough surplus wealth to buy finely drilled ornaments. It needs traders capable of transporting those goods to distant markets. Now imagine several things going wrong at once. A weaker monsoon reduces agricultural surplus in one region. River shifts make transport more difficult in another. A Gulf route becomes less reliable. Political turmoil in Mesopotamia changes demand. The workshops do not necessarily vanish in a single year, but orders fall, materials arrive less often, Skilled workers leave for places where food is more secure. Standardized production becomes harder to sustain. No single broken link destroys the whole network, but enough weakened links can change what the network is capable of doing. This may be one reason the later Indus period looks different archaeologically. The great urban centres lose population. Some standardized practices become less widespread. Long-distance exchange appears to contract in certain areas. Craft traditions continue, but often in altered forms and at different scales. That does not prove foreign trade caused the decline. The evidence does not allow us to say that external demand may already have been falling because Indus cities were weakening for other reasons. Trade routes may have shifted in response to environmental changes rather than causing them. And local exchange did not disappear simply because overseas commerce became less important. But trade disruption could have been a force multiplier. A city under water stress can survive more easily if it can import materials, food, and wealth. A region facing poor harvests can endure if its trading partners remain strong. But when environmental instability and commercial instability arrive together, each problem makes the other harder to solve. The Indus civilization had been held together by more than rivers, fields, and walls. It was held together by movement of goods, movement of people, movement of information, movement of trust across a world too large for any one city to control alone. And when that movement began to slow, the urban system may have discovered just how much of its strength depended on connections that could no longer be taken for granted. That raises a harder question. What if the Indus world was not simply connected? What if it had become dependent on being connected? For centuries, that interdependence had been a strength. A farmer in one region could grow food suited to local conditions. A coastal community could collect shell, a mining district could supply copper. Craftspeople in a city could turn imported stone, metal, shell, and clay into goods valued across the civilization and far beyond it. No single settlement had to do everything. That is what specialization makes possible. When conditions are stable, specialization is incredibly efficient. People get better at particular tasks. Workshops can produce large numbers of high-quality goods. Trade moves resources from where they are abundant to where they are needed. A city can support bead makers, metal workers, potters, merchants, builders, seal carvers, boat crews, and administrators because farmers elsewhere are producing enough food to feed people who no longer farm. But specialization has a hidden cost. The more each part of a society relies on the others, the more damage can spread when one part begins to fail. And the Indus civilization was full of signs that its systems were closely coordinated. The stone weights are one example. Across an enormous area, archaeologists find weights made to recurring units. Not identical in every case. Not evidence of some modern-style National Bureau of Standards, but consistent enough to suggest that merchants in distant places could recognize the same basic values. That matters. A standardized weight is a promise. It tells a buyer that a measure of grain, copper or carnelian, means roughly the same thing here as it does hundreds of miles away. It makes exchange faster. It reduces arguments. It allows strangers to do business without knowing one another personally. The seals may have served a similar purpose. We still cannot read the Indus script, so we should be careful. A seal could have identified a merchant, a family, an institution, a shipment, or a ritual role. It may have done several of those things, but whatever the exact meaning, seals were part of a shared system of symbols. A small object, carried or pressed into clay, could communicate something important to people across a huge cultural landscape. Then there are the workshops, at sites such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Chandhu-daro, and Lothal, Archaeologists have found evidence of specialized craft production, bead drilling, shell working, metal working, pottery making, faience production. These were not necessarily factories controlled by a king. There is no clear evidence for that, but they were places where knowledge, raw materials, labour and trade came together in highly organised ways. And above all, there were the cities, planned streets, drainage systems, brick standards, wells, neighbourhoods built and rebuilt within recognisable patterns. These features did not appear by accident. They required coordination between households, craftspeople, builders and communities capable of maintaining shared infrastructure over generations. The Indus world may not have had one capital issuing orders to everyone else. It may have been a network of regions, cities, towns and villages held together by common practices rather than one central state. But a decentralized system can still be fragile. In fact, sometimes it is fragile in a very particular way. If a kingdom collapses, you can point to a palace, an army, a dynasty, a defeated ruler. But if a civilization depends on thousands of communities continuing to honor the same standards, move the same materials, and recognize the same symbols, there may be no single moment when it breaks. The system simply becomes harder to maintain. Maybe floods disrupt one city, maybe a river shifts away from another, maybe harvests become less predictable, maybe imported copper arrives less often, maybe distant demand for luxury goods declines. None of these changes has to be fatal by itself, but now imagine being a bead maker whose raw stone is delayed, a trader whose usual route has become risky, a city household paying more for grain, a village asked to provide labour for public drains when its own fields are struggling, a merchant presented with weights and seals that no longer carry the same confidence they once did. Trust begins to thin, and when trust thins, exchange becomes more expensive. More local, more cautious. This is one possible explanation for what archaeologists see in the later phases of the Indus tradition. Some of the civilization's most distinctive shared practices become less common or disappear. The widespread use of seals declines. The script, already frustratingly brief and difficult to interpret, fades from the archaeological record. Carefully standardized weights become less prominent. Urban craft production changes in scale and organization. The great cities no longer dominate the landscape as they once did. That does not mean everyone forgot how to make things. It does not mean every workshop closed. Many traditions continued. Pottery continued. Farming continued. Beads continued to be made. People continued living across the Indus region and beyond. But the old package of urban life, standardized measures, seal-based identification, specialized production, large planned settlements, and long-range exchange, was no longer being reproduced with the same intensity. And maybe that was not failure in the way we usually imagine it. Maybe it was adaptation. If climate and river systems were becoming less predictable, a large city could become a difficult place to sustain. It needed regular food deliveries. It needed functioning transport routes. It needed labour for wells, drainage, streets and buildings. It needed institutions, formal or informal, capable of organising thousands of people who did not all know one another. A village needed less. A household with fields, animals, storage jars, local water access, and close kin nearby could respond more quickly when conditions changed. It could shift crops, move seasonally, reduce dependence on distant materials, trade with neighbours instead of merchants from far away. That kind of local resilience may have become more valuable than urban efficiency. And that brings us to something we almost never ask when we talk about collapse. What if leaving the city was not always a disaster? What if, for some families, it was the most practical decision they could make? Before we follow where those people may have gone, There is one other possibility that has to be considered. When populations move, crowd into stressed settlements, or face declining nutrition and unreliable water, another pressure can emerge quietly, invisibly, and devastatingly. Disease. Disease is one of the most tempting explanations in any ancient collapse story. It makes intuitive sense. Put tens of thousands of people into dense settlements. Give them shared wells, crowded lanes, animals standing water after floods, food supplies moving in from outside, and seasonal shifts in population. Then add drought, crop stress, or disruption to drainage. That is exactly the kind of environment where infectious disease can spread quickly. But intuitive is not the same thing as proven, and with the Indus civilization, disease is one of the hardest possibilities to test. We have no written medical records, no surviving descriptions of fevers, outbreaks, burials during epidemics, or healers trying to contain an unknown sickness. The Indus script remains unread, and even if it could be deciphered tomorrow, there is no guarantee that its short inscriptions would tell us anything about public health. What we have instead are bones. And bones can tell remarkable stories. Just not always the story we want them to tell. A skeleton can preserve signs of injury, a healed fracture, a damaged joint, a blow that left a mark on the skull. It can sometimes reveal long-term nutritional stress, chronic infection, anemia, heavy physical labor, or disease processes that change the shape of bone. Teeth can record episodes of childhood stress in the form of enamel defects. Chemical analysis can sometimes offer clues about diet, mobility, and exposure to particular environments. But most diseases leave no clear trace on bone at all. A person can die from cholera, dysentery, typhoid, influenza, malaria, tuberculosis in its early stages, or any number of parasitic and bacterial infections without leaving an unmistakable skeletal signature. Even when a disease does affect bone, identifying it thousands of years later can be uncertain. Different illnesses can produce similar damage. Poor nutrition can make infection worse. Repeated physical stress can look, in some cases, like pathology. And then there is the biggest problem of all. An epidemic can kill fast. If a disease sweeps through a city and kills people within days or weeks, their bones may look almost completely normal. Archaeologists might find a burial and learn that the person died young. They might see no obvious wound, no obvious famine, no obvious explanation. The cause of death is simply gone. That means the absence of skeletal evidence for a pandemic is not proof that no epidemic ever occurred, but it also means we cannot reverse the logic and treat every sign of urban decline as hidden evidence of an epidemic. This is where collapse stories often become too neat. A city declines. Its drains are no longer maintained as carefully. Floodwaters leave behind silt. Food supplies become less reliable. Some people show signs of stress. Then someone says, disease must have been the final blow. Maybe. But maybe is doing a lot of work. The Indus cities were famous for water management. Mohenjo-daro alone had hundreds of wells. Houses often had bathing areas. Drains carried wastewater away from residential spaces. In many ways, this was an extraordinary urban achievement for the 3rd millennium BCE. But sanitation is never a simple yes or no question. A drain is useful only if it is maintained. A well is safe only if it remains protected from contamination. Flooding can overwhelm carefully built systems. Rising groundwater can change what seeps into a water source. Drought can force more people to rely on fewer wells. And dense neighbourhoods, even with sophisticated drainage, create opportunities for pathogens to move through water, food, insects, animals, and human contact. The same systems that made city life possible could, under changing conditions, become systems of vulnerability. Imagine a settlement dealing with irregular floods and weaker harvests. Wells need repair, drains clog, clean water becomes harder to guarantee. Families crowd together or move between settlements in search of security. Diets become less varied. Children already weakened by nutritional stress become more vulnerable to infection. You do not need a single dramatic pandemic for this to matter. Repeated diarrhea, intestinal parasites, waterborne infections, seasonal fevers, respiratory disease in crowded houses, illness that does not destroy a whole city at once but makes every other problem harder to solve. A sick farmer cannot work a field at full capacity. A sick craftsperson cannot maintain production. A household caring for ill children has less labour for repairs, trade, and food storage. A community already struggling with floods or unreliable rains has fewer reserves left when disease arrives. Illness could have been a compounding stress that is plausible. It is also difficult to demonstrate. The skeletal samples from Indus sites are limited. Human remains do not survive equally well in every soil or every climate. Some cemeteries may never have been found. Others may have been destroyed by erosion, construction, flooding, or ancient disturbance. At many settlements, only a fraction of the site has been excavated, and the people archaeologists recover are not necessarily a representative cross-section of everyone who lived there. The dead are a sample of a sample. Maybe a cemetery served one neighbourhood, one social group, or one period of time. Maybe the people who died during an outbreak were buried elsewhere. Maybe they were cremated, placed in ways that left little trace, or never recovered by archaeologists at all. A few dozen skeletons cannot automatically speak for a city that may once have held tens of thousands. Even mortality patterns are hard to interpret. If more young adults appear in a burial sample, was there disease? Migration? Different burial customs? Incomplete excavation? If children are underrepresented, does that mean they survived, or that infant burials were handled differently? Archaeology can ask these questions. It cannot always answer them. So disease belongs in the Indus story, but not as a solved mystery. There is no decisive evidence for one civilization-wide plague, no mass graves clearly linked to epidemic death, no biological signature that lets us say an outbreak swept from Harappa to Mohenjo-daro and brought the urban system down. But there is also no reason to imagine that people living through environmental and economic disruption were somehow protected from illness. The more the old systems frayed, the more health risks may have multiplied. And the more health risks multiplied, the harder it may have become to maintain the cities that depended on coordinated labour, reliable water, and regular food. Disease may not have been the cause, it may have been one of the consequences. And consequences can become causes in their own right. But if illness offers one invisible pressure on the Indus world, another theory claims something far more visible happened. Not disease, not gradual adaptation, not rivers moving and trade thinning. Violence. For more than a century, the idea of invasion has refused to disappear. For more than a century, the idea of invasion has refused to disappear. It is simple, it is dramatic, and it seems to explain everything at once. A powerful outside people arrive. Cities burn. Their defenders are killed. The old civilization falls. The newcomers take the land, bring a new language, new gods, new social order, and the Harappan world is finished. It is the kind of story that feels satisfying because it has a villain, a battle, and a clear ending. The problem is that the Indus evidence does not give us that story. The classic version emerged in the early 20th century, when archaeology in South Asia was still young and deeply shaped by colonial ideas about race, language, and civilization. European scholars had already noticed that Sanskrit, the ancient language of the Vedas, was related to Greek, Latin, Persian, and many European languages. This was a major linguistic discovery. It showed that these languages belonged to a broad Indo-European family. But then came the leap. If Sanskrit was related to languages from far beyond South Asia, some scholars assumed its speakers must have entered the subcontinent from outside. That part was not unreasonable. Languages do spread through migration, contact, trade, elite power, and population movement. But early theories often turned a complicated process into a racial drama. They imagined light-skinned Aryans sweeping into India, defeating darker-skinned native populations, and founding a superior civilization. These claims were never just neutral interpretations of evidence. They were shaped by 19th century racial categories, by colonial politics, and by the dangerous idea that language families represented biologically distinct and unequal human races. They do not. Aryan originally referred to a linguistic and cultural category in ancient texts. It was not a biological race. But once the word entered European racial theory, it became attached to fantasies of conquest and superiority that would have consequences far beyond archaeology. Then, in the 1940s, the invasion theory seemed to find its smoking gun. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler examined a small number of human skeletons found in unusual contexts. Some were discovered in streets and rooms rather than in formal graves. To Wheeler, this looked like evidence of a final massacre. He connected the bones to lines in the Rigveda describing Indra destroying enemy forts, and famously asked whether Indra himself had been responsible for the destruction of the city. It was a powerful image. Invaders at the gates, bodies in the streets. A great city overwhelmed. But powerful images are not the same thing as proof. Later analysis showed that the skeletons did not all come from one single event. They were not necessarily people killed at the same time, in the same attack, by the same enemy. Some may have been deposited long after the periods Wheeler associated with the city's decline. The evidence for violent death was limited. A few injuries on a few individuals cannot establish a city-wide massacre, much less a conquest that destroyed an entire civilization spread across more than 1 million square kilometers. And this is the larger problem. If a massive invasion ended the Harappan cities, archaeologists might expect widespread signs of warfare, burned destruction layers appearing across multiple major sites, fortifications smashed in a clear pattern, weapons embedded in bodies, large numbers of unburied dead, abrupt replacement of local material culture by that of invaders. That is not what the record shows. There was violence in the Indus world, almost certainly. No large society is completely free of conflict. Some skeletons show traumatic injuries. Some settlements had walls, gates, and controlled entrances. But walls can protect against floods, animals, theft, and local raiding as well as armies. And isolated injuries are not evidence for an empire-ending war. The Harappan cities did not all appear to burn at once. They did not all show the same destruction horizon. They did not all empty on the same day. Instead, what we see is messier. Major urban centres declined over generations. Building standards changed. Long-distance exchange weakened. Some neighbourhoods were abandoned. Some towns shrank. Populations shifted towards smaller settlements, especially in the east and south. The old urban network unravelled, but it did not look like a single military catastrophe. That does not mean nobody moved into South Asia from outside. This is where the argument becomes more difficult and more important. The rejection of a simplistic Aryan invasion does not prove that the subcontinent was sealed off from migration. It was never sealed off. South Asia had connections with Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Sea for thousands of years. People moved, traders moved, herders moved, marriage partners moved. Ideas, technologies, and languages moved. Linguistic evidence strongly suggests that Indo-Aryan languages entered South Asia from a wider Indo-Iranian world. Genetic research also points to population movements into the region during the second millennium BCE, including ancestry connected to steppe pastoralist populations. But neither linguistics nor genetics can, by itself, show an army destroying Mohenjo-daro. A language can spread without exterminating everyone already there. It can spread through long-term migration through intermarriage, through pastoral communities expanding into new regions, through elite networks, through ritual prestige, through political power that leaves little archaeological trace. And it can spread after an urban civilization has already begun to fragment for other reasons. Timing matters here. The major decline of the mature Harappan urban system was underway by roughly 1900 BCE. The later spread of Indo-Aryan languages belongs to a complex and still debated history across the second millennium BCE. Those processes may have overlapped with late Harappan populations and post-urban societies. They may have transformed parts of northern South Asia profoundly. But that is not the same as saying mounted invaders arrived, slaughtered the cities, and caused the collapse. The old theory survives because it offers certainty. One people, one invasion, one cause, but the evidence keeps pulling us back toward a more complicated reality. Archaeology asks what happened in settlements. Linguistics asks how languages are related. Genetics asks about ancestry and population mixture. Ancient texts ask how later communities remembered their world. Each source has something to contribute. None should be forced to answer questions it cannot answer, and none should be used as a weapon for modern ideology. The Indus decline was not solved by removing invasion from the story. Population movement remains part of the story. Cultural change remains part of the story. Conflict may have occurred in places we have not yet found, but the fantasy of a single violent conquest destroying an entire civilization has far more narrative force than archaeological support. The cities were not simply conquered, they were already changing, and the people who lived through that change did not vanish with the bricks. So where did they go? It is the question people ask whenever they hear that Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and the other great centres declined. And usually hidden inside that question is a much darker assumption. If the cities emptied, then the people must have disappeared. But cities are not people. A city can fail while the families who built it survive. A trade network can break apart while farmers keep planting. A writing system can stop being used while old skills, old customs, old memories continue in smaller communities that no longer leave monuments large enough for us to notice easily. The evidence suggests that something like this happened across the former Indus world. After around 1900 BCE, the pattern of settlement begins to change. Some of the largest cities lost population or were abandoned. The immense, carefully planned urban centres of the mature Harappan period no longer dominated the landscape in the same way. But this was not simply a map turning blank. In many regions, archaeologists find increasing numbers of smaller settlements. Villages, small towns, seasonal camps, new communities built closer to local fields, grazing lands, and more dependable water sources. The population may not have vanished. It may have become less concentrated, less urban, and much harder for archaeology to see as one single civilization. Think about what leaving a city might actually mean. It does not necessarily mean thousands of people packing their possessions on one morning and marching away in a single column. A family might leave after 3 failed harvests. Another might move because a canal silted up, or because a local river channel shifted beyond reach. A trader might follow new routes eastward. A herding group might spend longer periods away from the old town, then stop returning at all. A household might divide, with one branch remaining near an aging city while another tries its chances in a smaller settlement 50 kilometers away. Repeat that process over generations across hundreds of communities, and eventually the great city is no longer a great city. Not because its people vanished, because its people made 1,000 separate decisions. There is strong evidence for shifts toward the east and south, though we should be careful not to imagine one universal migration route. The Indus civilization covered an enormous area, from the highlands and river plains of present-day Pakistan to northwestern India and the coast of Gujarat. Conditions were not changing in the same way everywhere. Neither were people responding in the same way. In the eastern regions, settlements became increasingly important along and beyond the Ghaggar-Hakra system, in areas connected to the Sutlej-Yamuna corridor and the wider Ganges-Yamuna region. This did not mean that entire city populations suddenly relocated into the Ganges plain. Many of the major developments farther east happened gradually, over long periods, involving communities with different local histories. But the broad direction matters. As rainfall patterns shifted and river systems changed, regions farther east may have offered new possibilities for farming, especially where seasonal water and groundwater remained more reliable. The centre of gravity of settlement was no longer fixed on the old Indus cities. To the south, Gujarat became increasingly significant. Harappan communities had long been active there. This was not some untouched refuge discovered only after the northern cities declined. Gujarat already had settlements, trade connections, craft traditions, and its own local character within the larger Harappan world. But during the late Harappan period, parts of the region continued to support communities even as older urban networks weakened. Places changed, people adapted, and the civilization became more regional. That word matters, regional. During the mature Harappan era, there had been extraordinary standardization across vast distances. Similar brick proportions, similar weights, similar seal styles, similar urban layouts. Shared craft practices. A merchant or official travelling across hundreds of kilometres could recognise a familiar system. After the urban decline, that intense standardization loosened. Pottery styles became more local. Settlement layouts varied more. Communities developed distinct regional identities. But variation is not the same as total rupture. In many late settlements, archaeologists see continuities with the older Harappan world. Pottery traditions changed, but they did not emerge from nowhere. Farmers continued growing crops with deep roots in earlier agricultural systems. Wheat, barley, pulses, and other local staples remained important in many places, while millets became more significant in some regions where they suited changing conditions. Craft traditions also persisted. Ornaments made from shell, stone, faience, and other materials did not simply disappear from human life because the big cities declined. Techniques of bead making, pottery production, and household manufacture continued, sometimes in altered forms and at smaller scales. The old system of elite workshops and long-distance distribution may have weakened. But knowledge does not vanish as quickly as institutions do. A potter can teach a child. A farmer can preserve seeds. A bead maker can carry tools, techniques, and habits into a new village. And a community can remember how things were done long after the political or economic system that once connected it has fractured. This is one reason the archaeological record can be so difficult to interpret. We want clean categories: Harappan, post-Harappan, migrant, native, collapse, replacement. Real human lives do not organize themselves so neatly. When people move, they do not always move far. They may relocate from floodplain to upland, from city edge to nearby village, from one river channel to another. They may move seasonally, following herds or shifting cultivation between dry and wet months. They may marry into neighbouring communities and gradually become part of them. Their children may grow up speaking differently, making slightly different pottery, and identifying with a new local place while still carrying older traditions in their homes. Migration is not always an event. Sometimes it is a process so slow that no generation recognizes it as migration at all. And when communities meet, they do not necessarily replace one another. They blend. A household arriving from an old Harappan town might marry into a farming village with its own customs. New styles of ceramics might appear beside older ones. Different food traditions could merge. Local religious practices might absorb outside symbols, while incoming families adopt the language and social rules of their new neighbours. This kind of cultural mixing is difficult to excavate because it rarely leaves a dramatic destruction layer. No burned palace, no battlefield, no final inscription saying, "We have become something new." Instead, it leaves fragments. A changed pot shape, an older bead tradition, a settlement built in a different place, a burial custom that combines elements from more than one community. And behind those fragments are people making practical choices in a changing world. The question, then, may not be, where did the Indus people go? That question makes them sound like a single population that boarded a ship and disappeared beyond the horizon. A better question is this: how did the lifeways of Indus communities change when the cities no longer held the world together? Some moved, some stayed, some reorganized around villages, herding regional exchange and local agriculture. Some merged with neighbouring populations. Some carried Harappan practices into new cultural worlds that would eventually become difficult to recognize as Harappan at all. The civilization did not walk away in one direction. It scattered, adapted, blended, and changed. And that means the end of the cities was not necessarily the end of the people. It was the beginning of many different futures. And this is where the word collapse can start to mislead us. Because when we say the Indus civilization collapsed, it sounds like a light switching off. One year, cities, seals, standardized weights, merchants, brick drains, planned streets. The next year, nothing. But that is not what the evidence shows. What seems to fade after around 1900 BCE is not human life across the region. It is a particular way of organizing human life, the vast urban network, the intense standardization, the systems that linked distant communities into something archaeologists can recognize as one civilization. The great cities lost their dominance. Their public infrastructure was no longer maintained at the same scale. Their trade connections weakened, their signature seals became rare. The still undeciphered Indus script, so common on seals, tablets and small objects during the mature Harappan period, largely disappeared from use. And that matters. For centuries, people across an enormous territory had used a shared visual language. They stamped goods, marked identities, recorded something, although we still do not know exactly what. Perhaps names, titles, institutions, ownership, religious formulas, commercial transactions. The script will not tell us. Not yet. Then it fades. Not necessarily because every person who could read it died. More likely because the institutions that needed it were no longer operating in the same way. If long-distance trade contracts disappear, if centralized storage systems shrink, if workshops no longer produce goods for distant markets, then the practical value of a standardized script may shrink with them. Writing is powerful, but it can also be fragile. A script survives when communities keep teaching it, using it, needing it. If those networks break apart, a script can vanish within a few generations, even while the descendants of its users continue farming the same land. The seals faded, the script faded, the precise system of weights that once made trade predictable across hundreds of kilometers also became less uniform. But farmers did not forget how to farm. People still knew which seeds to save after harvest. They knew when to plant wheat and barley in winter fields. They knew how to grow pulses, how to manage livestock, how to use seasonal grazing grounds, how to shape clay into storage jars, how to drill stone beads, how to work shell, copper, and faience. Those are not small things. They are entire libraries of practical knowledge, carried not in inscriptions but in hands, habits, and families. A child learns to make a pot by watching someone make a pot. A farmer learns the rhythm of a field by walking it year after year. A craft worker does not need a city archive to remember how a stone drill bites into carnelian. And when large institutions weaken, this kind of knowledge can outlive them. Across the regions once connected by the Indus world, archaeologists find continuities mixed with change. Agricultural practices persisted, though crops and strategies varied according to local conditions. In some areas, millet became more important, probably because it could fit different rainfall patterns and growing seasons. Older cereal traditions remained significant elsewhere. Herding continued, village life continued, craft production continued, though often at a smaller scale and with more regional variation. This is not the picture of a dead landscape. It is the picture of a landscape becoming less centralized. During the height of the Indus civilization, material culture had been astonishingly consistent. The same brick ratios appear across distant sites. Similar weights turn up in different cities. Seals follow recognizable conventions. Pottery, ornaments, tools, and settlement plans reveal a world with shared rules. Afterward, those shared rules became less strict. Regional cultures became more visible. In Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, Haryana, and the wider northwest, communities developed local pottery styles and local settlement traditions. Archaeologists give some of these later material patterns names: Cemetery H in parts of Punjab, Jukar in Sindh, Rangpur-related traditions in Gujarat, and others beyond them. These labels are useful, but they can create another illusion. They can make it seem as if one people vanished and entirely different peoples suddenly appeared. Usually the reality is messier. A new pottery style may reflect migration. It may reflect trade. It may reflect changing tastes, new cooking methods, new marriage connections, or potters adapting to different local clays. Often it may reflect several of those things at once. Material culture changes. People do not become strangers to their own past overnight. That is why some archaeologists prefer a different word for what happened: de-urbanization. Not the destruction of society, the shrinking of cities. The movement of population, labour and authority away from large urban centres and into smaller settlements, rural communities, and regional networks. It is a less dramatic word than collapse, but it may fit the evidence better, and the Indus world is not alone in this. After the end of the Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean, major palace centres fell, trade routes fractured, and writing disappeared from Greece for centuries. Yet people remained. They farmed, built villages, passed down skills, and eventually created new societies. After the Western Roman Empire fragmented, cities declined in many regions. Roads were less consistently maintained. Long-distance systems changed. Imperial institutions disappeared. But rural life continued, local economies continued, and Roman practices survived in altered forms across Europe and the Mediterranean. The city can die before the countryside does. The state can disappear before its population does. And an empire or a civilization can stop looking like itself long before its people stop existing. The Indus case may be even harder to trace because it left us no readable final chapter. No royal chronicle describing a famine. No temple inscription mourning a lost river. No letter from a merchant explaining why the ships stopped arriving. No king claiming victory over a rival city. We do not even know whether there were kings in the sense familiar from Egypt or Mesopotamia. So we are forced to reconstruct this transformation from broken walls, abandoned streets, changed crops, altered pottery, scattered beads, and a script that remains silent. That silence makes the ending look cleaner than it probably was. The urban civilization fades from view. Its symbols become rare. Its great centres lose their purpose. But underneath that silence, people are still moving, planting, trading, marrying, adapting, and passing knowledge forward. The Indus civilization did not disappear all at once. It became harder to recognize, and that distinction may be the key to everything. And once we see that, the search for one perfect explanation starts to fall apart. Because every major theory explains something, and every major theory leaves something out. Climate change explains why farming may have become less predictable in some regions. A weakening or shifting monsoon could reduce the reliability of rain-fed agriculture. It could change which crops made sense to plant. It could make the margins of settlement harder to sustain. For communities already dependent on seasonal rhythms, even small changes repeated over decades could become a serious problem. But climate alone does not explain everything. The Indus world covered an enormous area. Rainfall did not change in exactly the same way everywhere. Some places became drier, others may have faced different seasonal patterns. Some communities adapted by changing crops, others moved closer to more dependable water sources. And if drought were the whole story, we might expect a single broad abandonment horizon sweeping across the region. We do not see that. The timelines are uneven. Some cities declined earlier than others. Some settlements persisted. Some regions show continuity long after the great urban centres had lost their former scale. People were not all standing in one city, watching the same sky, suffering the same disaster at the same moment. Then there are the rivers. A river changing course can be devastating. If a settlement depends on a channel for water, transport, floodplain farming, and access to trade, the movement of that channel can turn an advantage into a liability. A river that once fed fields can move away. A channel can become seasonal. A floodplain can become too unstable to live beside safely. That helps explain why some areas seem to have lost population while others gained it. But again, it does not explain the entire transformation by itself. The Indus River did not vanish. Communities continue to live in its wider basin. And the old civilization was not built beside one river alone. It was a network spread across Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, Haryana, Baluchistan, and beyond. Different regions had different water systems, different rainfall patterns, different crops, different vulnerabilities. One river could disrupt one part of the system. It could not automatically erase every other part. Flooding presents the opposite problem. At Mohenjo-daro, layers of silt and rebuilding suggest that floodwater was a recurring fact of life. Not necessarily one final catastrophic inundation, but repeated pressure. Flood, rebuild, flood, raise the streets, flood, repair walls. For generations, the city may have been fighting the river that had helped make it possible. Eventually, the cost of staying may have become too high. But floods are local. They can damage a city without ending a civilization. And people in the Indus world had lived with rivers for centuries. They knew how to build platforms, raise structures, manage drainage, and rebuild. Flooding becomes a stronger explanation when it combines with other stresses: weaker trade, reduced labour, uncertain harvests, political fragmentation, or simply the loss of confidence that rebuilding was worth it one more time. That is how a problem becomes a crisis. Not when one thing goes wrong. When several things go wrong, and each makes the others harder to manage. Think about trade. The mature Harappan world depended on connections across vast distances. Raw materials moved between regions: carnelian, shell, copper, timber, stone, and probably food and textiles flowed through networks that linked villages, workshops, towns, ports, and cities. Trade reached outward to Mesopotamia and the Gulf, but it also ran internally, connecting communities across the Indus region itself. If those networks contracted, the consequences would not be limited to merchants. Craft specialists lose customers, workshops lose raw materials. Cities lose the goods and revenue that made large populations possible. Standardized weights become less useful if fewer transactions are happening across long distances. Seals become less useful if the institutions that recognize them no longer have the same reach. And a city built around coordination is especially vulnerable when coordination begins to fail. Not because its people are helpless, because complexity has costs. A large urban centre needs food arriving consistently. It needs water systems maintained. It needs workers to repair drains, clear silt, make bricks, protect storage areas, and organise exchange. It needs some degree of trust between people who may not know one another personally. It needs the wider countryside to keep functioning. If harvests become less predictable, villages may hold more grain locally rather than sending it outward. If rivers shift, transport gets harder. If trade weakens, specialists may leave. If flooding returns, repairs become more expensive. If public institutions shrink, the systems that once absorbed shocks begin to fail. None of these changes has to be dramatic on its own. That is the uncomfortable part. Civilizations do not always end with armies at the gates. Sometimes they become less able to solve ordinary problems. A blocked drain, a failed harvest, a broken trade connection, a workshop without imported stone, a flood wall that is not repaired before the next rainy season. Then another problem arrives before the first one has been fixed. Disease may belong in this picture too, although the evidence is limited. Dense urban populations, standing water, livestock, seasonal flooding, and long-distance movement of people and goods can all create conditions in which illness spreads more easily. Some human remains show signs of stress, injury, and disease, but they do not provide evidence for one identifiable epidemic that destroyed the civilization. That distinction matters. It is possible that disease added pressure to already strained communities. It is not responsible scholarship to turn scattered bones into proof of a civilization-wide plague. The same caution applies to violence. Conflict may have occurred. It would be surprising if it never did across such a large and changing world. But the archaeological evidence does not support the old image of invaders storming the cities and slaughtering everyone in a single final conquest. That theory was dramatic. It was memorable. And for a long time it filled the silence left by the unread script. But dramatic is not the same as well supported. Archaeological gaps are dangerous that way. A burned layer can become an invasion. A skeleton can become a massacre. An abandoned building can become proof of panic. But people abandon buildings for many reasons. Fires happen. Floods deposit silt. Walls collapse. Objects move after burial. And an absence of evidence can be filled with whichever story we already want to believe. The real evidence is often slower, messier, and harder to turn into a headline. A cautious synthesis may be the closest thing we have to an answer. Over generations, environmental instability may have made some farming systems less reliable. Shifting rivers may have changed where people could live and move goods. Repeated floods may have made particular cities increasingly difficult to maintain. Trade networks may have weakened, reducing the value of urban specialization and shared standards. Health pressures, Local conflict, migration, and social reorganization may all have shaped how individual communities responded. Not one cause, a chain of causes, and not one ending. Different cities, villages, and regions were experiencing different parts of the chain at different times. While one urban centre was declining, another community may have been adapting. While one trade route was failing, another may have remained active. While one population moved away from an unstable floodplain, another settled somewhere that better fit new conditions. The Indus world did not receive one final blow. It may have been pulled apart gradually by changes that were manageable separately, but overwhelming together. And somewhere inside those scattered changes lies the reason its ending still refuses to fit a simple story. But the evidence is not standing still. Every year, new tools are changing what archaeologists can ask of the Indus world. Not replacing excavation, not magically solving the mystery, but allowing researchers to see patterns that were invisible a generation ago. Satellite imagery is one of the biggest changes from space. Researchers can trace faint lines beneath modern fields and desert surfaces, old river channels buried embankments, the outlines of settlements flattened by centuries of erosion and farming. In some cases, these traces reveal that a place which now looks dry and empty was once connected to water, transport routes, and cultivated land. That matters because the geography of the Indus civilization is not fixed. Modern rivers are not ancient rivers. A settlement that seems strangely far from water today may once have stood near an active channel. A town that appears isolated may have been linked to a network of streams, wetlands, roads, and seasonal waterways that no longer exist. Remote sensing can help reconstruct that lost landscape, giving archaeologists a better idea of why people chose particular places to live. But it has limits. A line in a satellite image is not automatically a river. It might be an old channel, it might be a field boundary. It might be a modern disturbance, a road, a drainage ditch, or a geological feature. To know the difference, researchers still need to go to the ground. They need sediment samples. They need cores drilled into buried deposits. They need dates. That is where geoarchaeology comes in. By studying layers of sand, silt, clay, pollen, minerals, and microscopic organisms, scientists can begin to reconstruct how ancient environments changed. Was a channel flowing year-round or only during seasonal rains? Did floodwaters become more frequent? Did a river migrate slowly across the landscape? Or did it shift more abruptly after a major event? Did farmland become saltier, drier, or less fertile over time? These questions sound technical, but they go straight to the heart of the mystery. If cities declined because water became unreliable, we need to know when that happened, where it happened, and how severe it really was. If communities moved toward different regions, we need to know whether those regions were becoming wetter, more stable, or simply easier to manage. Climate proxies can help with that too. Cave formations, lake sediments, marine cores, glacier records, pollen sequences, and chemical signals preserved in ancient materials all offer indirect clues about rainfall and temperature. None gives us a perfect weather report for one Harappan town in one particular year, but together they can reveal broader trends: monsoons weakening, seasonal patterns shifting, droughts becoming more common, or rainfall becoming less predictable. And less predictable may be the crucial phrase. Farmers can adapt to dry years. They can adapt to wet years. What is harder to manage is a world where the old expectations stop working, where rains arrive at the wrong time, where a flood comes after a poor harvest, where the river still flows but not where it used to, where the strategy that kept a community alive for generations suddenly becomes unreliable. Then there is the question of movement. Where did the people go? Archaeology can show that settlement patterns changed. It can show populations becoming more dispersed. It can show new communities appearing in some regions as older cities declined in others. But isotope studies may eventually make that picture more personal. The chemical signatures in teeth and bones can sometimes reveal where an individual spent childhood and whether they later moved elsewhere. Different landscapes leave different traces through local water, food, and geology. With enough samples, researchers may be able to map patterns of migration. People leaving flood-prone cities, families moving between regions, or newcomers arriving in settlements that were growing after urban centres declined. Ancient DNA could add another layer. It may help identify how populations were related across the vast Indus region. It may reveal whether communities mixed widely or became more locally isolated over time. It could clarify whether the people living in late Harappan settlements were largely descendants of earlier urban populations, migrants from nearby regions, or some combination of both. But ancient DNA is especially difficult in South Asia. Heat, moisture and time destroyed genetic material. Human remains are also relatively scarce at many sites, and ethical questions matter deeply when studying ancestral populations. Even when DNA survives, it cannot tell us what people believed, who held power, why a family chose to leave, or whether a city's institutions had lost legitimacy. Genes can trace connections, they cannot read minds. And that brings us back to the greatest barrier of all. The Indus script remains undeciphered. Thousands of inscriptions survive, usually short sequences on seals, tablets, pottery, tools, and other objects. They may contain names, titles, commodities, rituals, transactions, places, or administrative information. Or perhaps some combination of all of them, but because we cannot read them with confidence, the civilization cannot explain itself in its own words. We do not have its royal inscriptions, if it had kings. We do not have its tax records. We do not have its letters complaining about failed harvests, broken trade agreements, flood damage, labour shortages, or political conflict. Maybe such records never existed in the form we expect. Maybe they are still buried. Maybe the short inscriptions served purposes we do not yet understand. But until the script is deciphered, the internal perspective of the Indus world remains largely silent. Future excavations may help. Many sites remain underexplored. Others were excavated decades ago before modern dating methods, residue analysis, microscopic study, and environmental sampling became standard. Returning to old places with new techniques could refine the chronology of decline. It could show whether neighbourhoods were abandoned suddenly or gradually, whether workshops continued after elite systems weakened, whether food production changed before people moved or after. But time is not on archaeology's side. Indus sites are threatened by expanding cities, roads, canals, agriculture, industrial development, looting, erosion, rising groundwater, stronger floods, and climate change. Once a mound is cut away, built over or stripped of its layers, information disappears forever. Not just objects' context, the order of events, the evidence needed to tell one story from another. So the mystery remains open, not because nothing can be known. It remains open because more is still being discovered. Every buried channel, every grain of ancient pollen, every newly dated settlement, every seal, skeleton, and sediment core has the potential to change the map of what happened. The Indus civilization has not given us its final answer. But it is still leaving clues, and maybe that is the point. We keep asking what destroyed the Indus civilization because that is how ancient endings are supposed to work. A city burns, an army arrives, a dynasty falls, bodies pile up. A final date can be circled on a timeline, and the mystery becomes simple. Something happened, then everything stopped. But the Indus world does not seem to have ended that way. One of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world changed over centuries without leaving us a confirmed final catastrophe. Its great cities lost population, monumental urban systems weakened. Standardized weights became less widespread. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia faded. Writing became rare and then disappeared from the archaeological record. The dense network that had connected cities, towns, workshops, farms, ports and river settlements no longer worked in the same way. That much is real. But decline is not the same thing as disappearance. Mohenjo-daro was not necessarily abandoned in one terrifying moment. Harappa did not simply vanish from the map. Across the wider region, people kept living. They built smaller settlements. They adapted local traditions. They changed pottery styles, farming strategies, trade routes, and perhaps the social institutions that had once held urban life together. The civilization became something else, and that transformation may have been uneven, confusing, and deeply human. In one region, unreliable monsoons may have made farming more difficult. In another, a shifting river channel may have cut a settlement off from water, transport, or fertile floodplain land. Elsewhere, floods may have repeatedly damaged neighborhoods and forced people to rebuild until rebuilding no longer made sense. Trade networks could have weakened as distant demand changed, making specialized production less profitable and reducing the flow of materials that cities depended on. None of these pressures needed to destroy every place at once. In fact, they probably did not. That is why every single cause explanation breaks down when it meets the full evidence. Drought does not fit every site. Flooding does not fit every date. River movement matters enormously in some landscapes, but cannot explain the decline of communities far from a changing channel. Trade disruption helps explain the fading of certain urban systems, but not why people chose particular new places to settle. Disease is possible in crowded cities, but the evidence is too limited to make it the answer. Invasion remains a powerful story, but it is not strongly supported by the archaeology as a civilization-wide explanation. The Indus decline may not have had one cause, because it may not have been one event. Picture a vast civilization spread across an area larger than many modern countries. Not one city, not one government we can identify, not one climate zone, not one river, not one economy. Communities from the coast to the plains, from major cities to villages, all responding to changing conditions in their own ways. Some people may have stayed until their city could no longer support them. Some may have left early, following relatives toward more reliable water or better farmland. Some may have turned away from long-distance exchange and toward local survival. Some may have seen opportunity where others saw disaster. A smaller town can be easier to feed than a huge city. A decentralized network can survive conditions that overwhelm a highly organized urban system. What looks like collapse from the perspective of Mohenjo-daro may have felt, for many families, like relocation, adaptation, a difficult choice made one season at a time. That does not make the change less important. The great urban world of the Harappans did not continue in its earlier form. The planned streets, massive brick architecture, standardized systems and far-reaching commercial links that had defined its mature phase were never rebuilt on the same scale. Something extraordinary was lost, but people were not erased. Their descendants remained in South Asia. Their knowledge, crops, crafts, settlement patterns, and cultural practices may have continued in ways that archaeology is still trying to trace. Civilization did not fall off a cliff. It fragmented, shifted, and carried on through smaller lives in different places. And perhaps that is the hardest kind of ending to understand. Not a final scream. A long, quiet change. A river moving a little farther away. Rains becoming a little less dependable. Trade becoming a little less worthwhile. a city becoming harder to maintain, then eventually people deciding that the future is somewhere else. The uncertainty around the Indus civilization is not a failure of archaeology. It is an honest reflection of the evidence we have, the evidence we have lost, and the enormous complexity of the world we are trying to reconstruct. We should be suspicious of anyone who claims to have solved the mystery with one dramatic answer. Sometimes the past does not give us a clean ending. Sometimes it gives us a warning because modern societies also depend on systems that can seem permanent. Predictable weather, reliable water, trade connections, infrastructure, cooperation between distant communities. The question is not only why the Indus cities changed, it is whether we recognize slow-moving change while there is still time to adapt. If this story made you think, please like the video, comment and subscribe. And tell us where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.